This is the 35th year of a harsh, brutal, and vicious occupation supported unilaterally by the United States, constant terror and atrocities. Suppose Palestinians say, well, we're under terrorist attack for 35 years, therefore we have a right to carry out suicide bombings.
Which is what they say.
Do you accept this? Does anybody accept it?
Nobody accepts it.
All right, then how come everyone accepts the Israeli claim to be doing it, which is a much weaker claim? Because after all, there's no symmetry in this situation. They are the military occupiers. Palestine isn't occupying Israel. And this isn't just started now. It's gone on years ago. I mean...
So does that, in your mind, justify
no,
the
it does not.
bomb?
Of course not.
It
doesn't in anybody's mind.
So it invalidates both sides.
Those who defend suicide bombing, and there are very few, don't have a leg to stand on. Those who defend the Israeli atrocities, including the U.S. government, most intellectual opinion, a good bit of the West generally, yeah, they don't have a leg to stand on either, and they have a much weaker position. For 35 years, there has been a harsh, brutal, miserable military occupation. There has not been a political settlement. The reason why there has not been a political settlement is that the United States unilaterally has blocked it for 25 years. Is it supported by the entire world, including the majority of the American people? The answer to that question is yes. There is a political settlement that has been supported by virtually the entire world, including the Arab states, the PLO, Europe, Eastern Europe, Canada.
Didn't Barack put that on the table?
No, he did not.
He did not.
It is also supported by the majority of the American people. It has just been reiterated by Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has unilaterally blocked it for 25 years. What Barack put on the table, the population doesn't know this because people like the Western media, the media in Canada and the United States don't tell them. Like, you can check and see how often you, for example, or others have reported what I just said. Don't bother checking. The answer is zero. The Barack proposal in Camp David, in the Barack Clinton proposal, in the United States, I didn't check the Canadian media. In the United States, you cannot find a map, which is the most important thing, of course. Check in Canada and see if you can find a map. You go to Israel, you can find a map. If you go to scholarly sources, you can find a map. Here's what you find when you look at a map. You find that this generous, magnanimous proposal provided Israel with a salient east of Jerusalem, including the city of Ma'ale Adumim, which was established primarily by the Labor government in Clinton in order to bisect the West Bank. That salient goes almost to Jericho, breaks the West Bank into two cantons. Then there's a second salient to the north, going to the Israeli settlement of Ariel, which bisects the northern part into two cantons. So we've got three cantons in the West Bank, virtually separated. All three of them are separated from a small area of East Jerusalem, which is the center of Palestinian commercial and cultural life and of communication. So you got four cantons, all separated from the west, from Gaza, so that's 5 cantons, all surrounded by Israeli settlements, infrastructure development, and so on, which also incidentally guarantee Israel control over the water resources, the reason. Last comment. This does not rise to the level of South Africa 40 years ago, when South Africa established the Bantustans. That's the generous, magnanimous offer. Okay. And there's a good reason why maps weren't shown, because as soon as you look at the map, you see it.
All right. However, that's the characterization of it, but let me just say, Arafat didn't even bother putting a counter-proposal on the table.
That's not true.
They negotiated at Taba afterwards.
That's not true.
But I guess my question is, if they don't continue to negotiate...
That's totally false.
That's false?
Not only is it false, but not a single participant in the meetings says it. That's a media fabrication.
That Arafat didn't put a counter-proposal on the table?
They had a proposal. They proposed the international consensus, which has been accepted by the entire world, the Arab states, the PLO, the majority of the American... Sorry. They proposed a settlement which is in accord with an overwhelming international consensus,
my question is, if
and is blocked by the United States.
problem that people look at now, the Middle East, is they say it's spun out of control. How do you get back to?
First way we get back is by trying the experiment of minimal honesty. Okay, let's try that experiment. If we try the experiment of minimal honesty, we look at our own position, and we discover what I just described, that for 25 years, the United States has blocked the political settlement, which is supported by the majority of the American population and by the entire world, except for Israel, virtually. I mean, there's some marginal exceptions. So first thing we do is accept the honesty to look at that. We take a look at Camp David, and we see, yeah, it was the same. The United States was still demanding a Bantustan-style settlement and rejecting the overwhelming international consensus and the position of the American people. We then discover that the United States immediately moved to enhance terror in the region. So let's continue. On September 29th, Ehud Barak put a massive military presence outside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, very provocative. When people came out of the mosque, young people started throwing stones, the Israeli army started shooting, half a dozen people were killed, and it escalated. The next couple of days, there was no Palestinian fire at this time, and this is all in occupied territories. In the next couple of days, Israel used U.S. helicopters. Israel produces no helicopters. Uses U.S. helicopters to attack civilian complexes, killing about a dozen people and wounding several dozen. Clinton reacted to that on October 3rd by making the biggest deal in a decade to send Israel new military helicopters, which had just been used for the purpose I described, and of course would continue to be. The U.S. press cooperated with that by refusing to publish the story. To this day, they have not published the fact. It continued. When Bush came in, one of his first acts was to send Israel a new shipment of the most advanced military helicopters in the arsenal. That continues right up to a couple of weeks ago with new shipments. You take a look at the reports from, say, Jenin by British correspondents like Peter Beaumont in the London Observer. He says the worst atrocity there was the Apache helicopters buzzing around, destroying and demolishing everything. Yeah, this is enhancing terror. And we may easily continue. We can take, also, let me continue. On December 14th, the Security Council tried to pass a resolution calling for what everyone recognizes to be the obvious means for reducing terror, namely sending international monitors. That's a way of reducing terror. This happened to be in the middle of a quiet period, which lasted for about 3 weeks. The U.S. vetoed it. 10 days before that, there was a meeting at Geneva of the high contracting parties of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which has unanimously held for 35 years that it applies to Israel. The meeting condemned the Israeli settlements as illegal, condemned a list of atrocities, willful destruction of property, murder, trials, torture, and so on and so forth.
Right, okay.
What happened to that meeting? Oh, I'll tell you what happened to that meeting. The U.S. boycotted it. Therefore, the media refused to publish it. Therefore, no one here knows that the United States once again enhanced terror by refusing to recognize the applicability of conventions which make virtually everything the United States and the Israel are doing there a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions, which means a war crime. Just a minute. These conventions were established in 1949 in order to criminalize the atrocities of the Nazis in occupied territory. They are customary international law. The United States is obligated, as a high contracting party, to prosecute violations of those conventions. That means to prosecute its own leadership for the last 25 years. There are a lot of problems in the world for which it's pretty hard to figure out a solution. This one happens to be particularly uniquely easy to figure out the solution. There is one. It's been on the table for 35 years. Virtually the entire world supports it. The only holdouts are the United States and Israel, at least in theory and words. Europe, non-aligned countries, the Arab states, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, They basically all agreed on a political settlement on the internationally recognized border, it's the so-called Green Line, pre-67 borders, with two states, Israel and a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, and possibly some adjustment of the border. It was a ceasefire line. So when the U.S. was still part of this consensus, it called for mutual, moderate and mutual border adjustments. That was actually brought to the Security Council in January 1976. The U.S. vetoed it again in 1980. This won't run through the whole record, but it's basically a record of U.S. refusal to accept it. Of course, Israel refuses. They want to take over as much as is valuable to them of the occupied territories. Now, since there actually is one occasion when the U.S. came close to accepting it. That was in January 2001, Clinton's last month in office. He provided what he called parameters for settlement. Both sides accepted them, as he pointed out. They met for a week in Taba, Egypt, tried to work out the details, and they apparently came pretty close to a settlement.
Well, I was in the Middle East recently as well, and one of the things I heard, we were in Ramallah, and we talked to a lot of Palestinians on both sides of the border, that the split between Hamas and Fatah is, number one, weakening any real form of resistance, and number two, that any state that might emerge out of this two-state, if in fact anything does, and there's generally a feeling that Israel, the current leadership of Israel and most of the Israeli elite has no interest in it, but that this split between Hamas and Fatah is really undermining any real Palestinian resistance. What do you make of that?
It's real, and there's a background. I mean, since the early 90s, the United States and Israel have been working to try to separate the Gaza Strip from the West Bank. By now, they're almost totally separated. A student in Gaza who wants to go to a university in the West Bank, almost impossible. If somebody wants to go for medical treatment in a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem, which isn't available on the Gaza Strip, it's essentially blocked, partly by Palestinian Authority and Hamas, but primarily by Israel. So that's gone very far. Even by the 80s, Israel had recognized it just wants to get rid of the Gaza Strip. It's so devastated, no use, hand it over to Egypt. That increased. In January 2006, there was a free election in Palestine, first one in the Arab world, carefully monitored and so on. It came out the wrong way. Hamas won the election. Okay, that's not what the U.S. wanted. And in the typical disdain for free elections, if they don't come out the right way, the United States and, of course, Israel instantly turned to harsh punishment of the population for the crime of voting the wrong way. Europe trailed along timidly, as it usually does. In June 2007, the U.S. and Israel tried to carry out a military coup to overthrow the results of the election in Gaza. It didn't work. It was beaten back, and Hamas took over. And at that point, sanctions became much harsher. And what you now read is, Hamas by force took over the Gaza Strip. Well, sort of half true, but it was in beating back a U.S.-Israeli planned military coup initiative. By now, Hamas kind of runs the Gaza Strip with a pretty harsh hand. The Palestinian Authority runs as much of the West Bank as they control, which is very little of it, pretty harshly and with international support. And yes, that split is there. And both sides by now have a stake in it. Hamas to run the Gaza Strip, Fatah, Palestinian Authority to run the West Bank. And it's a barrier to joint resistance. Of course, the U.S. and Israel are very happy because they want to undermine the possibility of a settlement. Now, the settlement option is still there. January 2001 is not that far back. Things have changed, but not so much. And it's feasible. If the United States shifted its policy, right now the United States is basically blocking it not in words. They say, yes, we want it. But they're blocking it by providing decisive military, economic, diplomatic, and ideological support for the Israeli takeover. Ideological means, well, it's the way it's presented and discussed and so on.
Our most cherished ally.
Yeah, but and it's significant. I mean, by now Israel, the settlements occupy over 40% of the territory. About 60% of the territory is called Area C, is under the control of the Israeli army. That's not necessary.
When I was in the West Bank and in some of the refugee camps in Beirut and in Lebanon, a lot of Palestinians were saying they thought that the two-state solution is dead, and that there's really is one state, and then they're all living under the same one state. It's just that some people get to vote and others don't, and that the issue now is that there should be a movement, one person, one vote, and that people, the Palestinians and Jews that want a democratic state, should simply take over the one state that's there.
Personally, I've been in favor of that since the 1940s. But it's pie in the sky. And they're omitting the fact, this is a common discussion on both sides and in the world, and it's just omitting an elementary fact. There aren't two alternatives, there are three alternatives. They're only talking about two. One alternative is the international consensus on two states. Second alternative, let's all live together in one state. The third alternative, which is the one that's being implemented, is that the U.S. and Israel take what they want and continue to take what they want. And those who are talking about let's have one state are actually assisting in that, because the United States is perfectly happy to have articles in newspapers saying, fine, let's everybody live together. Meanwhile, they are participating with Israel in separating Gaza from the West Bank, a crucial fact, and providing the decisive support for the implementation of the programs which are sometimes called the Sharon Plan. Take over whatever you want in the West Bank, everything behind the annexation wall. It's called separation wall. It's basically annexation. That means the arable land, the water resources, the pleasant suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, support the completely illegal expansion of Jerusalem. That's not only in violation of international law, but even of direct, explicit Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. indeed voted for. The whole occupation settlement program is illegal, and it's been known. Israel even accepted it in 1967, said we're going to do it anyway. But it's not even worth discussing. There's universal agreement on this. But the U.S. is blocking it, and that permits these programs of taking over what's valuable, everything, hugely expanded Jerusalem, everything behind the separation wall, the annexation wall, the Jordan Valley, which imprisons everything else, a couple of salients cutting through it, which essentially cantonize the rest. By now, Israel's constructed a huge infrastructure project, huge highways and so on. You can drive from Tel Aviv to the most easternmost towns like Ma'ale Adumim or Ariel without ever seeing a Palestinian. Palestinians are sort of off there in the hills somewhere. So that's the real alternative. If there isn't a two-state settlement, this is what there's going to be. You can talk about one state and it would be nice to be democratic and so on, but nothing is supporting it. There's no support for it in the world. There's no steps towards it. Sometimes it's compared to South Africa, but what people are forgetting is there was decades of struggle to get the world to oppose apartheid. And in fact, until the United States changed its position in the late 1980s, it didn't really matter what the world thought. The U.S. was still supporting it. Reagan was violating congressional sanctions at that point. But until the U.S. shifted its position, it was there. As late as 1988, the Reagan administration condemned the African National Congress, Mandela's National Congress, as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world.
Do you see any potential for a change in U.S. position?
Sure.
To some extent, a change in U.S. public opinion?
Oh, there's a substantial change in U.S. public opinion. I mean, a lot of issues. I mean, there was a time not long ago when I talked about these issues. I needed police protection. And now there's huge audiences. They're engaged. There's what's called BDS, sanctions divestment program, which is substantial. A large part of the American public, if they knew about it, would be opposed, in fact outraged by the idea that Obama made a commitment to Israel to provide them with $30 billion of military aid over the next decade. People here are even talking about the U.S. military budget. Most people don't want it handed over to Israel. So sure, it would be, and in fact, if Obama or anybody in the administration was willing to take a stand on this, they could mobilize public opinion. Now, what's happening is pretty striking. The strongest support in the media, the most extreme support for Israeli expansion and aggression, is the far right. It's the Wall Street Journal, much more than, say, the New York Times. In the political system, it's the Republicans, the party of big business, even more so than Democrats too, but they're more so. And in fact, the military industry, high-tech industry, and so on, they think this is fine. They're investing there. Lockheed Martin is delighted when we give Israel funds to buy advanced aircraft and so on. There is a base of support for these policies right at the core of the system. There's also a substantial lobby which is influential. Well, I think that's minor as compared with these more fundamental sources of support. But those are not, it's kind of like what we talked about on another occasion. It's not what the public wants, and that can be changed.
How would you respond to the charge that anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism?
Actually, the locus classicus, the best formulation of this, was by an ambassador to the United Nations, Abba Eban, Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, in an article that he wrote about 45 years ago, which I urge you to read, which appeared in an American Jewish journal, Congress Weekly, a major journal of the more liberal wing of the American Jewish community. He wrote an interesting article in which he was then UN ambassador from the State of Israel. He advised the American Jewish community that they had two tasks to perform. One task was to show that criticism of the policy, what he called anti-Zionism, that means actually criticisms of the policy of the State of Israel, were anti-Semitism. That's the first task. Second task, if the criticism was made by Jews, their task was to show that it's neurotic self-hatred, needs psychiatric treatment. And he gave two examples of the latter category. One was I.F. Stone, the other was me. So we have to be treated for our psychiatric disorders, and non-Jews have to be condemned for anti-Semitism if they're critical of the State of Israel. It's understandable why Israeli propaganda would take this position. I don't particularly blame Abba Eban for doing what ambassadors are sometimes supposed to do, but we ought to understand it. There is no sensible charge. No sensible charge. There's nothing to respond to. It's not a form of anti-Semitism. It's simply criticism of the criminal actions of a state. Period.
You mentioned free elections in Gaza, and it's so great that they have free elections, which I am definitely behind. But you also mentioned how they elected Hamas, so I looked up the Hamas charter, and I just wanted to quote a few things and then see your thoughts on those. So Article 28, Muhammad is dead. He left his daughters behind. Israel, by virtue of it being Jewish and of having a Jewish population, defies Islam and the Muslims. Let the eyes of the cowards not fall asleep.
We can agree that the Hamas charter is horrible, but now let's look at the Hamas charter. The Hamas charter was written by maybe half a dozen people in 1988 at a moment of an extreme Israeli attack on Gaza. It has no status. They've repeated over and over again that it doesn't apply anymore. And if you're interested in charters, why keep to that? Take the governing party in Israel, Likud. It grew out of Cherut. That's its ideological center, Begin's Cherut, Netanyahu's Cherut. Its position, never changed, is that the land of Israel, that the entire land of Israel belongs to the Jews. That includes today's Jordan, okay? In fact, the old slogan was, both sides of the Jordan. That's ours, and this is too. They've never changed that. So that's their charter. Did anybody pay attention to it? Of course not.
So you've mentioned Israel's faults many times, which I think we can all agree it has significant problems. And as an activist, we want to deal with Israel's faults. But
Sorry, who? I didn't hear.
Okay, I think we can all agree that Israel has many faults.
Israel has many faults.
Yeah, and that we would like to do something about that. What do you envision us also doing about Palestinian faults, and how, as an activist, can we deal with what the Palestinians have been doing, what Hamas has been doing, and what do you see with that?
Hamas are not my friends. I don't like what they do. But they've been doing not much. What they've been doing is what I described. I didn't have time to go through the pattern, but I'll repeat it. You can find it. Starting in November 2005, an agreement was reached between Israel and the Palestinian Authority then, not Hamas. Israel completely rejected it, and Hamas lived up to it, not a single rocket. Then came the January election, and Israel intensified its attack with U.S. support. After that, there are repeated attacks, Israeli attacks, and ceasefires agreements. Every ceasefire agreement is approximately like what I read. What happens is Israel completely dismisses and disregards it, maintains the siege in violation of the ceasefire, increases the violence. Hamas lives up to it, and Israel officially accepts that agrees to that, until some escalation of Israeli violence leads to a Hamas reaction, and then another episode of mowing the lawn. That's been going on since November 2005. Hamas is not a nice organization. They do a lot of rotten things. That's for the Palestinians to worry about. But it has nothing to do with us. If we were supporting Hamas, nothing, zero. If we were supporting Hamas, it would be our problem. But we're not. And what they do is for Palestinians to deal with. What we deal with is what we are doing, which is supporting massive criminal operations all over the region, blocking peace. That's for us to be concerned about. Those who are supporting Hamas can worry about Hamas.
Why does the United States support Israel? Well, there's a history, and a very interesting one. It actually goes back a long time. One thing to remember is that Christian Zionism is a very powerful force, which goes back long before Jewish Zionism. In England, particularly, Christian Zionism was a powerful force among British elites. It's part of the motivation for the Balfour Declaration and for Britain's support for Jewish colonization of Israel. Remember, the Bible said, and that's a big part of British elite culture. Same in the United States. Woodrow Wilson was a devout Christian who read the Bible every day. So did Harry Truman. In the Roosevelt administration, one of the leading officials, Harold Ickes, once described the return of the Jews to Palestine as the greatest event in history. It's realizing the lesson of the Bible. These are deeply religious countries in which the biblical commands, so-called, are taken quite literally. Also, this is just part of colonization. This is the last phase of European colonization. And notice that the countries that are most strongly in support of Israel are not just the United States. It's the United States, Australia, and Canada, the offshoots of England, Anglosphere sometimes called, unusual forms of imperialism. These are settler colonial societies, societies in which not like India, not like the British in India, say. Societies, South Africa was a little like this, or Algeria under the French. Settler colonial societies in which the settlers came in, essentially eliminated the native population. Also driven by religious principles, very religious groups driven by Christian Zionism. Those are major cultural factors. There are also significant geostrategic factors. You go back to 1948, there was actually a split between the State Department and the Pentagon in the United States over how to react to the new state of Israel. The State Department was not committed strongly to Israeli conquests, the establishment of the state, and was concerned about the refugees. It wanted an implementation of the refugee problem. The Pentagon, on the other hand, was very impressed with Israel's military potential. The Israeli military successes, if you look back at the internal record and declassified, the Joint Chiefs of Staff described Israel as the second largest military force in the region after Turkey and a potential base for U.S. power in the region. That continued. Can't run through the whole record, but in 1958, when there was a serious crisis in the region, Israel was the only state that strongly cooperated with Britain and the United States, and it won plenty of support from the governments and the military for that reason. 1967 is when the current relations with Israel were pretty much established. Israel performed a major service to the United States by destroying a secular Arab nationalism, a major enemy of the United States, and supporting radical Islam, which the U.S. supported. And it continues right until the present. Right now, we saw an example of that just during the latest Gaza attack. You recall that at one point, Israel began to run out of munitions during the assault, despite the fact that it's armed to the teeth. The United States provided Israel with additional munitions through the Pentagon. And notice where they were taken from. These were U.S. munitions pre-positioned in Israel for eventual use by U.S. forces. One of many signs of how Israel is regarded as essentially a military offshoot of the United States. Very close intelligence relations that go way back, many other connections. And the media tend to take up, to support the policy of the government with very few, kind of little questioning around the edges, but basically accept the policy. So, for example, take another issue. Take the U.S. invasion of Iraq. You cannot find the phrase U.S. invasion of Iraq in the U.S. media, though it was obviously an invasion, a blatant act of aggression, a textbook case of what the Nuremberg trials called the supreme international crime, cannot be mentioned. President Obama is praised as an opponent of the invasion. And what did he say? He said it's a mistake. It's a strategic blunder. We're not going to get away with it. Now, that's the kind of opposition that you heard from the German general staff during Hitler's invasion of Russia. It's a blunder. Shouldn't do it. We should knock off England first. That's regarded as opposition. Same in Vietnam. There's now a commemoration underway, big commemoration of U.S. sacrifices in Vietnam. Try to find the phrase U.S. invasion of South Vietnam there or anywhere in the past year since 1961 when it took place. Non-existent, maybe on Democracy Now, what I write, but way out at the fringe. And this is not unique to the United States. Take, say, Britain. Right now there's interesting debates in the British literary journals, like the Times Literary Supplement, as to whether Britain should finally begin to recognize the genocidal, the word that's used, genocidal character of British colonization hundreds of years ago. Should Britain begin to face it? You can ask that question in many places. The tendency of the intellectual community to go along like a herd in support of state power, private power, is just overwhelming. Intellectuals like to think of themselves as dissident, critical, courageous, standing up against power. Absolutely untrue. You look at the historical record, that's a small fringe, and they're usually punished. The mainstream tends to be what was once called a herd of independent minds, marching in support of state power. Nothing new here. Unfortunate, you have to fight against it, not new.
Well, I was saying that I'll start with a couple of general comments on the topic, and then we can throw it open to discussion. It's quite usual these days to draw analogies between South Africa and Israel. Most of them, I think, are questionable at best. But there's one that isn't discussed much, if at all, that is actually quite valid, I think, one analogy. That has to do with the topic, with the matter of what's nowadays called legitimation and delegitimation. That was an issue for South Africa for about the last 40 years of the white nationalist regime. Back in 1958, the South African foreign minister called in the U.S. ambassador to talk to him and said, we know that we're becoming a kind of an international pariah. Everyone's voting against us in the United Nations. We're right, but they don't understand it. But it doesn't really matter, because you and I both understand that there's only one vote at the United Nations, namely yours. And as long as you, the United States, back us up, we don't really care what the world thinks. And so matters, in fact, proceeded through the, by the 1970s, the United Nations did declare an arms embargo on South Africa. South Africa, by that point, was reacted by becoming extremely aggressive and contemptuous towards the international community, and in fact, even the United States. President Carter at that time. So, for example, when President Carter and a group of international diplomats were about to present a plan for a South African withdrawal from Namibia, a UN protectorate which they were occupying, sending in a population and so on, in violation of UN orders. Just at that point, South Africa attacked a refugee camp in Angola, Kasinga refugee camp, killing 800 people, causing international outcry, but they basically didn't care. Well, fortunately for them, Ronald Reagan came along, and he strongly supported the apartheid regime and continued to support it right through the 1980s. That included its aggression and violence in neighboring countries, which was quite lethal, killing over 1 million people, plus what was going on within South Africa. But the U.S. supported it. In fact, U.S. trade with South Africa increased. That was in violation even of congressional sanctions by that time. And the justification for it was the war on terror. Now, the war on terror was not declared by George W. Bush, contrary to what's claimed. He redeclared it. It was declared by Ronald Reagan when he came into office in 1981, announcing that international terrorism, plague of the modern age, would be the focus of U.S. foreign policy. So in the case of South Africa, the justification was you had to defend the white nationalist regime against the terrorism of the African National Congress.
In fact, in 1988, the U.S. Designated, this is Mandela's ANC, he was of course in prison, the U.S. designated the ANC as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. In fact, Mandela was just taken off the terrorist list about 2 years ago. He can now come to the United States without a special dispensation. Then the U.S. policy changed. Around 1989, 1990, the U.S. policy shifted, and within 2 or 3 years, the white nationalist regime had collapsed and apartheid was over. This is not the only time that's happened. Incidentally, that was not the only factor. Another major factor was Cuba. Cuba, which had played an enormous role in the liberation of black Africa. It's sort of well known by now to scholarship, but not to the general public. They essentially drove South Africans out of Namibia, and as they had driven them out of Angola, and that was a big factor. But the main change was just that the U.S. policy shifted. And exactly as the South African foreign minister had said 40 years earlier, when the U.S. changed policy, the regime collapsed. As I say, there are other cases. Well, the problem for South Africa was its delegitimation in the international community, sustained by U.S. support, so it didn't matter until U.S. support was withdrawn, and the legitimation of its main enemy, the African National Congress, which by the late 80s had enormous international support. Mandela's kind of a secular saint by now. Those of you who follow Israeli affairs know that that's pretty much what they're discussing now with great concern. There's concern that the country is being delegitimated in the international arena. And at the same time, it's the Palestinians are being legitimated. It's a situation, and they have one supporter, the United States, alone. In fact, that has gone on for a long time. You probably know that a couple of months ago in February, there was a Security Council resolution calling on Israel to pursue what in fact is official U.S. policy, namely to stop settlement expansion. It was vetoed by the United States alone. That aroused some attention, but it really shouldn't have, because the U.S. had been vetoing resolutions condemning Israel's actions for a long time. The first one was in January 1976, 35 years ago, when the major Arab states brought to the Security Council a resolution calling for a two-state settlement, Israel and a Palestinian state, on the international border, so-called Green Line, and then it took up the wording of UN 242, which everyone recognizes to be the main diplomatic instrument. So there would have to be added guarantees for the security of every state in the region and its right to exist within secure and recognized borders. That's 1976. The U.S. vetoed it again in 1980. I won't run through the rest of the record, but until the present, that's been the pattern. Things moved out of the Security Council because I was excluded by the U.S. veto, but the General Assembly almost every year had regular votes, 150 to 2 or something like that, and that continues up to the present. Well, this is continuing. There'll be another important vote, very likely, in the coming session of the General Assembly starting next September as a winter meeting. What's coming up then is recognition of Palestinian statehood. By now, well over 100 countries recognize Palestine. That's about something like 80 to 90% of the world's population. In contrast, Kosovo, which is now accepted as in the United Nations, is supported by a tiny fraction of that. But the crucial difference is the U.S. does not join the 80 to 90% recognizing Palestine, and the U.S. does recognize Kosovo. So that's basically the South African minister's insight into how world affairs works, and he's correct. But anyway, this is going to come up, it's very likely going to come up in September, and it'll pose another dilemma for the United States. Will it stand virtually alone in the international system in blocking the kind of settlement for which there is simply an overwhelming international consensus? Hard to find anything like this in world affairs. But for years, there's been an overwhelming agreement on approximately the January 1976 Security Council proposal that the U.S. vetoed. By now it includes essentially everybody, at least formally, all the non-aligned countries, Europe, Latin America, the Arab League, which has an even more forthcoming proposal, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran, in fact, essentially everyone. The only holdouts are the United States and Israel, and the South African minister's principle still applies. There's only one vote, and that's the United States. It's the consequence of having overwhelming power. So the world can say what it wants, but if the United States objects, nobody can do anything about it. Well, that's the, and that of course shapes commentary and discussion and so on, at least in the United States, to some extent elsewhere, lesser extent. Well, that's basically the situation, and it's as far as Israel's delegitimation is concerned, they're getting much more concerned. So, for example, Human Rights Watch, which is a very conservative organization, they don't take strong positions on policy. They recently came out with a declaration, which I don't think was even reported here, at least I didn't see it, which called on the United States to terminate aid to Israel, any aid to Israel, up to the level of what Israel spends in the occupied territories. Because, as they point out correctly, all of that is in violation of international law. They also call on the United States government to investigate foundations, organizations, others in the United States, which have a tax-free status and are giving aid to anything in Israel that involves discrimination and repression. So that would include everything in the occupied territories plus more. That cuts quite a wide swath if you look at it. They also called upon Europe, and of course the United States as well, to boycott goods from the settlements and to refuse in any way to participate in activities in supporting Israeli activities in the occupied territories, all of which are illegal. I mean, that's not been in question for years. It was actually was recognized by the government of Israel back in 1967. Any transfer of population into the occupied territories is in violation of the Geneva Convention's core of international humanitarian law. As I say, that was recognized by Israel's top legal authorities back in 1967, including the Attorney General, including the official in charge of the occupied territories, General Moshe Dayan, who simply pointed out, sure, it's illegal, but states violate international law. And so we will too. And they can, as long as the big boys in Washington support them, basically the South African principle. And so it continues to the present. Most recently, the February 2011 Security Council resolution of which the core was supporting official U.S. policy, that is, calling for an end to settlement expansion. But the U.S. vetoed it in accord with the traditional pattern. We'll see what happens this September, but it could be quite significant. Amnesty International, which also very rarely takes strong positions on policy issues, had already called for an arms embargo on Israel directed to the United States, because this is the time of the Gaza invasion, because Israel was using the arms in violation of international law. They could have, but didn't add, that the arms that the United States is sending to Israel are also used in violation of U.S. domestic law, which conditions arms transfers on, very specifically, on particular uses only, defense and internal security, and of course anything. The Gaza war was obviously not that, and nor any of Israel's actions in the occupied territories. Well, Israel's reacting to all of this in pretty much the way South Africa did. A lot of hysteria, a lot of anger, circling the wagons, and carrying out actions, very brutal and arrogant actions, which are it's almost as if they're being carried out in purposeful defiance and contempt of international opinion, like the Gaza attack, or the attack on the flotilla last May, in which Israeli commandos landed on a ship in international waters that was trying to bring humanitarian aid to Gaza, and killed 9 people, including an American citizen, which both of those actions caused an international furor. But again, the one vote that matters didn't go along with international opinion, so they think they can get away with it. And in fact, if you read the Israeli press, they're quite surprised that there is any international reaction, because they're so obviously right in everything they do, just like South Africa. Since they're obviously right, it must be that the world is therefore wrong, and there has to be some explanation, anti-Semitism or whatever it might be. And the internal reactions in Israel are kind of like South Africa too, imposing pretty harsh legislation, some of it so pretty extreme, so much so that the head of the Israeli Bar Association, Shlomo Cohen, a pretty conservative figure, recently had an article lamenting what he called Israel's drift to fascism. It's pretty strong words, and he ran through the legislation that brought that led him to that conclusion. Well, these are it's not unfamiliar. In many respects, it is reliving the pattern of South Africa, particularly the reaction to the delegitimation that they perceived in the sanctions movement, the boycotts, other protests, and correspondingly the legitimation of their enemy, which will come to a head in just a few months in the case of Israel-Palestine, which will be a sensitive and interesting moment. Well, what are the options given these circumstances? One option is that the U.S. and will shift policy, as it did in the case of South Africa, and decide to join the world. That is, to join into the long-standing and quite overwhelming international consensus and accept a two-state settlement. Now, the general form of that settlement is pretty well known. I mean, you can argue about details, but the basic guidelines are quite clear. And in fact, it actually came quite close to realization once. There hasn't been 1 month in the last 35 years when a U.S. president was willing to tolerate a settlement in terms of the international consensus
That was Bill Clinton's last month in office, January 2001. There had been negotiations in the summer before at Camp David, and they broke down. And Clinton recognized that the position that the U.S. and Israel had proposed there could not be accepted by any Palestinians, no matter how moderate. So in December of 2000, Clinton proposed what he called his parameters, the general guidelines for settlement, which were somewhat vague but more forthcoming. He then made a speech in which he said that both sides had accepted the parameters, both sides had reservations. The two sides, Israel and Palestine, met in Taba, Egypt in January 2001. We happen to have a very detailed record of that, of those negotiations. There was international observers, detailed Israeli sources, and so on. And they came pretty close to a settlement, close enough so that in their last press conference, jointly the group said that if they had a little more time, they could have settled everything, all the details. Well, Israel called off the negotiations prematurely, and it didn't continue. There were informal, high-level negotiations that did continue, came out with proposals. One, the best-known one, is called the Geneva Accords, was presented in Geneva in December 2003 by the two sides. It was welcomed by the world. The Europeans sent envoys and so on. Israel rejected it. The U.S. refused even to comment on it, barely mentioned here in the press. But that was an extremely detailed proposal. You can think it was right or wrong, you can argue about it, but the facts are it was very close to the international consensus that has been accepted for a long time, and that happens to be exactly in accord with international law. It's been reiterated over and over, most recently even authoritatively by the International Court of Justice, with the U.S. Justice agreeing in a separate declaration a couple of years ago, 2004. Well, that's one option. One possibility is that the U.S. will make the same kind of move that it finally made in the case of South Africa, and then would come the task of implementing it, but it's really not a big problem. Once the U.S. agrees, it can be done. That's one option. Now, most of the discussion of this topic assumes that there's a choice between two options. One, the one I just described, and another, that Israel takes over the whole territory, and then the Palestinians carry out a civil rights struggle internal to the now unified Israel-Palestine, on an anti-apartheid struggle. So that's considered the other option. You look at most of the debate about the topic, that's what it is. Israel, in Israel, it's objected that this would create what they call a demographic problem, meaning too many non-Jews in a Jewish state, so that'll be a problem. But many Palestinians are supporting it. They say this is the way to go. A two-state settlement is out, so we'll have a one-state settlement in which we'll have an anti-apartheid struggle. There's only one problem with this. This discussion, it's omitting the third option, the realistic option. Israel will never agree to this, nor is there any reason to expect them to. What they'll do is the third option, namely continue doing exactly what they're doing. And if they have U.S. support, they can continue to do it. And we know what that is because it's happening under our eyes. It's been going on for years. Since the early 90s, the U.S. and Israel, and just about everything Israel does, should be called U.S.-Israel, because they work in tandem. And Israel cannot go beyond what the U.S. will support and permit it to do. So there's the U.S. and Israel, since the early 90s, have been committed to separating Gaza from the West Bank in strict violation of the Oslo agreements, which
declare them to be a territorial unity. It's been done in many ways, closures and so on and so forth. By now they're pretty separate. So if a person in Gaza, say a young person in Gaza wants to study in West Bank University, can't do it. If somebody in Gaza needs medical attention that they can get in a Jerusalem hospital, can't go. If somebody wants to see their family, not very many miles away, they can't do it. So by now they're pretty well split. That's one element. The second, with regard to the West Bank, is to take over Israel. The U.S. and Israel want to take over essentially what's valuable in the West Bank and to let the rest kind of rot. And we know exactly what it is because you can see it happening. And in fact, the plans have been developing step by step over the past 20 years. And sometimes it's called the Sharon Plan, sometimes something else, but it's always essentially the same. Israel takes over everything that's inside what's called the separation wall. It's actually an annexation wall. It's a wall which snakes through the West Bank, leaves on the Israeli side arable land, major water resources, the pleasant suburbs of the major cities like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, takes over the Jordan Valley, which essentially imprisons the rest, and then cuts corridors through the remaining area, one east of Jerusalem, and I should say Jerusalem is now about 5 times the size of what it was in 1967, annexed illegally in violation of Security Council orders. So it's a huge Greater Jerusalem, then corridor extending to the east, which pretty much bisects the West Bank. That's what it was built for. And 2 other corridors in the north, which separate the rest. And what's left amounts to roughly 50% of the West Bank, and 42% at the moment. Probably it'll expand. The rest, if Israel just takes that over, there's no demographic problem, because that region is kept free of Arabs, virtually. I mean, there's a couple of scattered Arab settlements, but essentially free of Arabs. So no demographic problem. Israel gets the valuable territory, the valuable land, whatever it likes, and the Palestinians are left in unviable cantons, pretty much separated from one another. That's the option. That's the alternative to having a 2-state settlement. Now, notice I say settlement, not solution. I don't think a 2-state settlement is or should be the end of the road. It could lay the basis for what seem to me better settlements, but you have to get there in stages. You can't just, say I want the world to be the way I want the world to be the way I like it. That doesn't work. You have to show how you get there, and there are possible ways to get there, but I have heard nothing that has any option but this one. So those are the realistic options. They depend crucially on the U.S. position. Will the U.S. join the world on this issue, or won't it? As I say, this goes far back. It goes back to the 1970s. There are many factors that keep the United States separate from world opinion, just as there were in the case of South Africa, many other issues. But we might as well face the reality. That's the structure of world order. The United States is an outlier. And it's so powerful that it gets its way. But it gets its way in violation of global opinion on many, many issues. That relates, I'll just say one word about this, to another major phenomenon that you're all familiar with, major events that have been taking place in the past few months, the so-called Arab Spring, the democracy uprisings in the Arab world. These didn't come out of nowhere. The background is not discussed much, but it's pretty easy to find out. So take, say, Egypt, the most important country. the biggest, most significant, and so on. The uprising, the January 25th movement, was led by a group of, initiated by a group of fairly young, kind of tech-savvy professionals, pretty much, who called themselves the April 6th movement. Well, why April 6th? Because on April 6th, 2008, there was a major labor action organized by what has been quite a militant labor movement at the Mahala textile conglomerate, one of the biggest industrial conglomerates in Egypt. They were going to have a labor action calling for, minimally decent working conditions, wages, and so on. And along with it were to be solidarity actions in the cities. Well, that was crushed by force, crushed by the US-backed dictator, Mubarak. So therefore we don't know about it, but they know about it. The victims tend to have memories. And that was reflected when the popular movement burst out again a few months ago, led by the April 6th movement. The same is true in Tunisia and the other places where things are happening. In any event, in the past couple of months, it's been quite spectacular. There have been major developments in the Arab world. There are moves towards, there are efforts to try to construct some kind of, to overthrow the brutal, repressive regimes and to bring about some sort of degree of freedom and democracy. And if you look closely, you'll find that the U.S. is pretty isolated on this, to an extent along with Western Europe. There happens to be a very good reason why the United States and its allies cannot tolerate a democracy in the Arab countries. A very simple reason. Do you want to figure out why? Just take a look at the polls of Arab public opinion. Now, they don't get reported in the press here, but they're known, and surely planners known. The polls are taken by the most prestigious U.S. polling organizations. They're released by major institutions, Brookings Institution, and so on. So they're perfectly public, and certainly in the eyes of planners are thinking about them. And what do you find when you look at them? Well, say, take Egypt, again, the most important country. In Egypt, 90% of the public thinks the worst threat they face is the United States and Israel, which they don't distinguish much from the United States, rightly. About 80% think the region would be better off and more secure if Iran had nuclear weapons. A small percentage, roughly 10% in the region, think that Iran is a threat. These figures extend, a little variation over almost the entire region. Well, if you have anything like a functioning democracy, then public opinion is going to be reflected in policy. That's what a democracy is supposed to be. So the idea that there could be a democratic uprising in the Arab world is just a nightmare for Western planners, and they will do whatever they can to prevent it. And if you look closely, that's pretty much what's happening. Well, it's also a nightmare for Israel. Israel has relied on the Arab dictators to suppress their populations and to enter into arrangements with it. And if public opinion manifests itself in policy, that's going to be a huge problem, and they know it. That's why they're so strongly opposed to the democratic uprisings. And the same is true here, though it's not put that way. Well, that's going to have an effect too. So far the uprisings have been fairly well controlled. They've changed the names, but not really the regimes. So say in Egypt, the military still runs the show, but that probably, you can't keep the lid on that forever. This has been going on for a long time. We don't read about it, but certainly planners know it. So again, go back about 50 years, and President Eisenhower, late 50s, was discussed in internal discussions. It's been declassified for years, so it's public. He discussed with his staff what he called a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, and not from the governments, they're more or less okay, but from the people. And right at that time, the National Security Council, which is the main planning body, came out with a memorandum discussing the Arab world, and they explained it. They said there's a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictators and prevents democracy and development, and that we do this because we want to make sure we can maintain control over their energy resources. And I went on to say that the perception is more or less accurate, and furthermore, that's pretty much what we should be doing. And so it continues right to the present. But again, chances you can keep the lid on this forever are not very high. So the explosion might get out of control, and that is certain to influence other developments in the region in quite unpredictable ways. Well, I'll stop with this. Just mention that the crucial issue that we should bear in mind, I think, is that contrary to almost all media and other commentary on this matter, the framework is not one in which, say, in Israel Palestine, the United States is an honest broker trying to bring about negotiations between two recalcitrant, difficult parties, Israel and the Palestinians. That's simply not true. If there were serious negotiations going on, they would be run by some authentically neutral party, and the US and Israel would be on one side, and the rest of the world would be on the other side. And that's the way they would have been going on for 35 years. Well, until we realize that, and until we do something about it, this region is going to continue to face extremely dangerous times and very explosive ones, which may blow up all over the world. I'll stop there.
The Arab League is calling the UN for a no-fly zone over Gaza as a resolution.
A no-fly zone?
Over Gaza? Will Israel accept this resolution, or will it just continue what it's doing?
There can't be a no-fly zone over Gaza because the ruler of the world doesn't permit it. Okay? Just like there's no interference when the US invades Iraq. I mean, look, that's the way the world works. It doesn't work the way you're taught in civics classes. The world is ruled by force, not by law. And force happens to be overwhelmingly in one place, not entirely, of course. And so there can be, if the U.S. is participating in an invasion, as it was in the case of Gaza, the Gaza invasion is a U.S.-Israeli invasion. That's why Amnesty International called for embargo. It's American arms they're using, American diplomatic support, and so on. So if the U.S. is participating in an act of aggression, no, you can't have any interference. So sure they won't. It won't even get to the point where it could be considered. I mean, that doesn't have to happen. These things happen because the American population permits it. We're the only ones who can stop it.
What percentage of military spending throughout the world is spent here in the United States?
It's close to 50%, a little below 50%. Of course, that depends somewhat on how you count it. So if you count the spending for past wars, for veterans, for interest on the debt, and so on, then it goes up even beyond that. But the standard calculations, U.S. military spending is close to 50% of global spending. And of course, it's quite totally different in character. So this is far more advanced in technological development and means of destruction. You could see that in Libya. I mean, the United States was kind of reluctant to get involved in Libya. France and Britain were in the forefront, but they couldn't even impose a no-fly zone without calling on the United States to do the heavy lifting. In the first couple of days, it was all U.S. Tomahawks and Warthogs and so on. The U.S. is so far ahead of the rest of the world in military expenditures that it's laughable. Like the Pentagon comes out with statements warning about, say, the Chinese military buildup, the next biggest power in the world. Well, it turns out, according to Pentagon calculations, is by memory, I may not have it exact, that the Chinese military budget is roughly, I think they said, a fifth of what the United States spends in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is a fraction of the military budget. And in fact, it's actually less than the U.S. military spends on research and development. I think that was their conclusion. Also, it's not just advanced technology, advanced killing techniques, and so on. It's many other things. I mean, is there any other country in the world that has 800 military bases all over the world where the troops are and supplies and so on are ready for use and are used? It's unique. Also, the U.S., despite what we're doing to our own country, I mean, the country is being internally crushed in the most astonishing ways. But despite that, it's still the richest country in the world with enormous advantages. That may not be true for long if current policies continue here, domestic policies.
So you spoke about the three options for how things could proceed. So theoretically, if America did change its policy in Israel, how would that affect the broader public opinion in the Arab world?
If the United States changed policies?
Yeah.
Well, one of the real irritants to Arab public opinion is U.S. support for Israel. It's not the only one. I think the National Security Council was basically correct back in the 50s and since that the main issue is that the United States supports harsh, brutal dictatorships, blocks democracy and development, and does so because that's the best way to keep control of their energy supplies. That's been the major issue. There are others, like for example, there are they're not regular, but there often are public opinion studies, and so for example, right after there was an interesting one right after 9/11. The Wall Street Journal, to its credit, did a study of public opinion in the Arab world about attitudes toward the United States. They just kept to the kind of people they were interested in. Bankers, professionals, what they called moneyed Muslims. They didn't care about what's called the Arab street, just the rich guys, the guys who were all involved in the U.S. Western international development programs and so on, the neoliberal programs. So they just did a study among them. Well, it turned out to be very much like the conclusions in 1958. Strong opposition to the United States because of its support of harsh dictatorships, its blocking democracy and development, and efforts to just control the energy system. They had other concerns by then. One concern was support for Israeli occupation and repression. The other concern, which strikingly never really hit the radar in the United States, but it did over the Arab world, was the Iraq sanctions. The Clinton sanctions on Iraq may have killed hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 1 million. They strengthened the dictatorship, they crushed the population, and they probably prevented Saddam Hussein from going the way of other dictators that the U.S. was supporting by internal revolt. And there was enormous bitterness about that over the whole Arab world. These are major crimes. So there are specific ones, but I think the basic one remains the what the National Security Council said. Actually, that's responsible for the fact that the United States and Britain, incidentally, also have fairly consistently supported radical Islamism in opposition to secular nationalism. You can see it right now. The main ally of the United States in the region is Saudi Arabia, which is the most extreme radical Islamic state anywhere. Also the main supporter of jihadism and funder of jihadism and the ideological center of it. Now that's been the main beneficiary of US and British support for a long time, because it's the right kind of dictatorship. It keeps the population under control. For example, there was an effort in Saudi Arabia to have a day of protest, a Friday day of protest like everywhere else. Saudi Arabia was crushed instantly. There was such an intimidating military force, nobody even showed up. And that was considered fine, so pat on the wrist. So they keep their population under control, but they also have most of the oil. And they make sure that it works the way the West wants. So they're the ones who, they can support jihadism, they can set up madrasas throughout the Arab world to train, and in fact even elsewhere like Pakistan, to train jihadis. The US and Britain don't mind as long as they serve their main function. It's quite consistent, and you see it in the internal records of both the US and Britain.
Do you see any chance of the uprising in Libya?
Sorry, who's talking?
Do you see any chance of the uprising in Libya having any spillover effect into Gaza?
See any chance of
having the population of Gaza uprise in a similar manner?
I don't think there can be an uprising in Gaza. Hamas is a pretty brutal outfit, and they run the place. They run a very tight ship. In fact, you can see developing a sort of a tacit agreement between Israel, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority to keep things the way they are. That allows Hamas to run Gaza. It allows the Palestinian Authority, sort of a subsidiary to Israel and the U.S., to run Gaza Strip, and of course Israel likes it. But there was an effort. You may have, about a year ago, I guess, there was a very brave statement of a group of young people in Gaza who came out through some electronic medium, I forgot how, with a strong statement calling for freedom, for justice, for an end to oppressive rule, and so on. Nobody knows what happened to them. They were crushed pretty quickly. The West Bank, it's kind of the same. There's an army which was originally trained and run by a U.S. general, Keith Dayton, now it's some other general, I forget who, which it works with the Palestinian Authority, and its task is essentially to keep the population quiet. In fact, when the time of the invasion of Gaza, there was concern that there might be protests in the West Bank, but there weren't any, because the Dayton army simply crushed them. And they were pretty proud of it. General Dayton himself gave a speech, you can pick it up on the internet, to the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. It was called, it's basically an offshoot of AIPAC, they call it an independent policy agency, in which he praised the achievement. He said, we did a really great job. We kept any protests from developing. In fact, we did such a good job that the Israeli army, which of course we work in close connection with, was able to take forces out of the West Bank and use them for the attack on Gaza, thanks to the U.S. Palestinian Authority cooperation through the Dayton Army, which kept them quiet. Senator John Kerry, who's our senator, who's he's sort of Obama's point man on the Middle East. He's the one who goes out and negotiates and so on.
He made a speech at the Brookings Institution. This would have been February 2010, I guess, maybe about a year ago, in which he said that things are kind of improving in the region. For the first time ever, he said, Israel has a legitimate negotiating partner. You know, they've been pleading for years for somebody to negotiate with them. And now finally they have a negotiating partner, the Palestinian Authority, and he had one bit of evidence, the Dayton Army. His evidence was that the Dayton Army was so effective that it was able to ensure that there would be not even a protest when Israel invaded Gaza. So that shows things are improving, you know. But to get back to your question, I think at least as things now stand, the chances of any uprising in Gaza seem very slim. They're just under way too much pressure, both internally and from Israel and up till now from Egypt. If there is a real democracy opening in Egypt, Egyptian policy might change, and Israel's quite worried about it. West Bank, it's conceivable that there could be some kind of resonance to the general protests throughout the region, but it hasn't happened yet.
Professor? Hi, good evening, in the back, on the first floor. You mentioned that a lot of the news coming out of that region doesn't reach the United States, and a lot of the messages that we do find in the mainstream media are biased. Can you make some recommendations on some either websites that we can read or newspapers or periodicals that would allow us to gain a more balanced view of what's going on in that region?
By now, there are plenty of sources available if you are willing to do a little work. Like for direct coverage, regular coverage, daily coverage, there's nothing that compares with Al Jazeera. It's highly professional coverage. It has its limits. Like Al Jazeera is based in Qatar, and they don't say anything about Qatar. And they don't, for example, when the uprising was crushed in Bahrain, they didn't say anything barely said anything about it because the Qatari government supported it. But with such limits, they do very good reporting. And in fact, they're the only, really expert, almost hour by hour reporting of the main things that are happening. Like during the Gaza invasion, they were giving 24-hour coverage on the ground. There was almost nothing else there. During these uprisings, like say Egypt, Tahrir Square, they were the ones who were right on top of it. They have Arab-speaking journalists, very high quality, and so on. They're kept out of the United States. I think there are 2 towns in the U.S. where you can even get it on cable television. Most of the world pick it up right away, but you can get it on the internet. And there are websites. First of all, you can get other journals. You can get other newspapers. So if you read, say, the British press, I don't want to say it's magnificent, but on this issue, it's a little more open. You can get pretty good reporting in the Guardian, the Independent, and so on, mixed with other stuff. And there are, if you take a look at some of the main popular web, general websites, say ZNet, there's a ton of material coming out constantly. I mean, you got to evaluate it. Not all of it makes any sense. It's like everything else. You have to use your judgment, but there's certainly a much broader variety. You better go to where the mic is.
I've heard some reports through various books that the United States provided a lot of funding for the back in the Cold War in Afghanistan and brought a lot of the guns and tanks into that region.
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
And the U.S. funding Gaddafi in Libya.
Funding Gaddafi?
Yeah, and a lot of regimes bringing military funding into other countries.
I mean, the U.S. support for Gaddafi is surreal, and it's amazing the way it's being suppressed. Like, right now, 2 weeks ago, there's a trial underway
in The Hague, International Tribunal, the International Tribunal on Sierra Leone, atrocities in Sierra Leone, which were horrible. The person on trial is Charles Taylor. The chief prosecutor is an American law professor from Syracuse University. He was very bitter about it. The trial just ended. He was very bitter about it because he wanted to try Gaddafi. He said they have evidence that Gaddafi was the main person responsible, as he put it, for killing over 1 million people in Sierra Leone. But Britain and the United States blocked it. And when he was asked why, he said, "Welcome to the world of oil," period. Right in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there's a group based in the Harvard Business School. It's called, what was it called? I forget the name of it, but they were just exposed by a Boston Globe reporter. They have been providing services to Gaddafi, including writing PR material for him, praising his magnificent thoughts about society and democracy and so on. Big shots at the Harvard Business School. In England, it actually hit headlines. So the head of the London School of Economics had to resign. It turned out that they were getting big grants from Libya, essentially giving gifts, like providing a doctoral dissertation for one of Gaddafi's sons, which I think was probably written by that Cambridge mass move. And yes, arms and everything else. I mean, the U.S. policy has been sort of mixed. I mean, he's not like the dictators in Saudi Arabia. He's not totally reliable. In fact, not at all. It's kind of a loose cannon. So when they have if they have an opportunity to get rid of them, they'll be happy to do it. Whereas, say, King Abdullah or something, then he can do what he likes. But yes, there's been plenty of support. I mean, these ought to be headlines, all of these things. Well, you better find the mic, because who's got the mic?
It's up there.
Where? Oh, okay. Yeah.
In your opinion, if the United States was able to switch entirely to domestically produced renewable energy resources, and we no longer need to rely on any oil from the Arab world, what sort of an impact would this have on U.S.-Arab relations?
Approximately zero, in my opinion. There's a lot of mythology about this. I mean, the U.S. doesn't get most of its oil from the Middle East. In fact, if you look at U.S. energy policy, so, for example, the year 2000, last Clinton year, they came out with a big study of energy, and the conclusion was the U.S., of course, has to control the Middle East, but that goes way back. But it should, that's a matter of world control. But the U.S. itself, it said, should rely on more secure Atlantic Basin supplies, meaning Western Hemisphere and West Africa. So the rest of the world can rely on insecure supplies, but we got to make sure we rely on secure ones. In fact, if you look back at the history, it really is surreal. So back in the 1950s, for example, the U.S. was by far the main producer, in fact, the main exporter. The Eisenhower administration made a decision to essentially eliminate U.S. domestic resources, to take U.S. oil only from Texas, which was much more expensive than from Saudi Arabia. But this was for the benefit of Texas oil producers. So there was a decision to exhaust U.S. domestic resources. Of course, they couldn't exhaust it, but to deplete U.S. domestic resources for the benefit of Texas oil producers and a couple of corrupt cabinet members who pretty soon were, big shots in the Texas oil system, and to pay a lot more for it. So Americans paid a lot more for oil. that's what they were doing, and that went on for, I think, 14 years, right through the Democratic administrations of the 60s. What they were essentially doing was depleting U.S. oil resources, leaving big holes in the ground, which we now call the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and we fill it up from imported oil from Saudi Arabia. I mean, these systems are run in order to make money for the right kind of people, not for reasons of security. And today, to get back to your question, if the U.S. were running 100% on solar power, we'd have exactly the same policies towards the Middle East. You go back to the global planning at the end of the Second World War. It was recognized pretty clearly, in fact said, quote, one of the leading advisors, one of Roosevelt Truman's leading advisors, that if we can control Middle East oil, we will have substantial control of the world, because it's such a powerful instrument of control. And that remained true right through the 50s, when the U.S. wasn't practically not using the oil at all, and it would continue today. These are instruments of world control.
Hello, Professor. This entire conversation appears to be revolving around a relationship with Israel. After Israel, the United States donates more money to Egypt than any other country, and we're also talking about Egypt. When talking about Israel's decisions about how to relate to its neighbors, you're talking about the demographic problem, and you were talking about the blockade of the wall, and also our blockade of the Gaza Strip. However, the blockade of the Gaza Strip is impossible without Egypt's help. And I believe that's why we give money to Egypt, and that's why we back Mubarak, to protect Israel and to allow them to defend their demographic situation. My question is, what is it that's compelling us to do such acts for Israel? What is it that we're so interested in? Is it about the oil?
What's the source of U.S. support? You're perfectly right. I mean, one of the reasons the U.S. and Israel were upset about the threat to Mubarak was that he was cooperating in the strangulation of the Gaza Strip. That's only one part of it. His agreement, there was a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in 1979. There's a long history of that, but the effect of the treaty was understood right away. It freed Israel up to carry out aggressive actions elsewhere. So you read Israeli strategic analysts, say Avner Yaniv, right in 1980. He said, okay, now Israel's free. We don't have any threat from Egypt, so therefore we're free to attack Lebanon, say, which they did. Right after that was their big invasion of Lebanon. And it's sort of been kept that way. So if Egypt did have a democratic uprising, succeeded, almost certainly that arrangement wouldn't remain, or at least would reduce in character, and then Israel would be forced to deploy forces in the southern region and so on. So why is the U.S. supporting Israel? Well, that's a very interesting question. And if you look closely, you can find reasons. So just ask yourself for a minute, where is the strongest support coming from? So take, say, the press. I mean, the most rabid pro-Israel newspaper is the Wall Street Journal. Now, the Wall Street Journal is not part of the lobby. It's the newspaper of the business world. The Republicans are far more extreme in support of Israeli expansion and atrocities than the Democrats. Jewish votes and Jewish money tend to go to the Democrats. But again, the Republicans are the business party. I mean, they're so deep in the pockets of corporate America, you need a telescope to find them. That's what they are. And so they're strongly supportive of Israel. If you look at the business community at large, you see pretty much the same thing. They think Israel's fine. So U.S. investment in high-tech industry in Israel keeps going up. Intel, major chip producer in the world, has a new generation of chips coming out that they say they think will take over the world market. And their main factory they're building right now is in Israel. They have a military industry. For them, Israel's a bonanza. So say take Lockheed Martin. When the United States essentially gives Israel F-35s, that's a huge boost for Lockheed Martin. But remember, it's a double boost, because when the U.S. gives arms to Israel, that's what's called in retail marketing a teaser. What it means is that Saudi Arabia, which has all the money, they're going to come along and say, we want something like that too. And then the U.S. can send second-rate arms, which they can't use anyway, to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. And in fact, Obama just made he's $3 billion to Israel, but he just made a $60 billion deal with Saudi Arabia. Well, that's for a long time been the way in which the U.S., and to a lesser degree Britain, recycle petrodollars, keep military industry functioning, and so on. So they love it. And they're a big lobby, they're very powerful. U.S. military and intelligence have had pretty close relations with Israel since the 50s and maintain them. Apart from all these kind of concrete bases of support, there are kind of cultural issues which I don't think should be dismissed. So the U.S., I don't have to tell you, is an unusually religious country. It's kind of off the spectrum, international spectrum in religious belief. And it's not just evangelicals, that's elites. It's elites too. And in fact, Christian Zionism, both in Britain and the United States, goes back way before Jewish Zionism. It goes back to the 19th century, before the Jewish Zionist movement even took off. And it's quite real. So for example, during the First World War, when British General Allenby conquered Jerusalem from the Turks, you just take a look at the headlines in the mainstream U.S. and British press. General Allenby was Richard the Lionhearted, literally, rescuing the Holy Land from the infidels. In other words, he was winning the War of the Crusades, finally. Huge cheers, Well, the next thing, after we get the Holy Land back from the infidels, is you have to follow the words of the Bible. Well, the Lord, to be precise, the war god, that's who the Lord of the Old Testament is, the war god promised the land of Israel to the Jews. So we got to bring the Jews back. That's fulfilling God's will. You go on to say the Roosevelt administration, secular administration, but one of Roosevelt's main advisors, Harold Ickes, who's secular, of course, said that the return of Jews to Palestine then is I think the greatest achievement in human history. He said something like that. And this goes all the way to the present. It's an extremely religious country. It extends over much of the population. People like Woodrow Wilson and Harry Truman, they're reading the Bible every day. And the Bible tells you things, like it tells you it's our holy land, doesn't belong to the infidels, they don't belong there, and the Jews have to go back. And then if you go way off to the Christian right, and you get into the revivalist movement, okay, then there's more things happening. Like that movement actually really took off in 1948. The Jews were back in Palestine. You go to now Israel. You go to the Book of Revelations. It goes on until you have Armageddon, and everybody slaughters each other, which is wonderful because the souls that are saved rise to heaven, including incidentally 144,000 Jews for some reason. But the rest are eternal damnation. So we've got to press this. And this again is not strange preachers in Texas. But this is right in the White House. So for example, take say George W. Bush. Well, it hasn't been discussed much, but when Bush was trying to get international support for the invasion of Iraq, we're now talking about January 2003, he met with the president of France, Chirac,
And we sort of have the documents from the French side. But Bush apparently started ranting about some extremely obscure passage in the book of Ezekiel. It's about Gog and Magog, and nobody knows what it means. I mean, are they people, are they places, whatever it is. But according to this passage, Gog and Magog come down and, you know, destroy Israel, and then comes Armageddon and all kind of things. Chirac had no idea what he was talking about. So he asked the French Foreign Office, the Élysée, if they could explain to him what this maniac is raving about. And they didn't know. So they contacted a Belgian theologian. Actually, that's how I found out about it. The Belgian theologian sent me a copy of a disquisition that he wrote to the French Foreign Office explaining the interpretations of this obscure passage and its role in, you know, Christian right, you know, fantasies. Well, you know, this isn't the White House. I mean, that stuff is not insignificant. And there are other things, too. The United States, remember, is a settler colonial society. The whole so-called Anglosphere, you know, the expansion of England, is settler colonial imperialism. The United States, Canada, Australia. That's the most vicious form of imperialism because it means wiping out the indigenous population. The French sort of was the same in Algeria, but most imperialism wasn't that way. It's the Anglosphere, which is typically settler colonial. And that's deep in our history. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I was a little kid, we were playing cowboys and Indians, and we were the cowboys killing the Indians. You know, I think it's a little better these days, but this is really deep in the culture. It's a settler colonial society. We belong here, they don't. They were, you know, all kinds of stories about how they didn't really have any right to the land, and should be. It's right through the most, you know, elite literature. You know, it's not crazy stuff, and that's just part of general consciousness. And you take a look at Israel, that's what it is, a settler colonial society. It's, you know, an advanced culture of Europeans coming into this land, eliminating the barbarians who don't belong there in the first place. And there's a kind of a natural sympathy that develops. I mean, I think all of these are factors that shouldn't be ignored. How deep they are is another question, but I mean, you could have said the same with South Africa. In fact, it was true in South Africa. There was a very natural association. South Africa is another settler colonial society. And there's a natural kind of sympathy in white America with white nationalist racism. It was real, you know. And nevertheless, the U.S. did change policy.
You kind of just started talking about the comparison to South Africa. In the beginning of your speech, you said that the comparisons are often questionable, and I was wondering if you could explain which ones are questionable and why.
I really don't think it's a very good comparison. First of all, in the case of Israel, there's two questions. One is Israel itself, and secondly, the occupied territories. Israel itself is a discriminatory society. There's plenty of discriminatory laws, and I've been writing about them for years. But it's nothing like apartheid. In fact, it's more like the United States has been through much of its history and still to some extent is. So it's bad, and it should be overcome, and there are things to say about it, but it's not apartheid. On the other hand, when you get to the occupied territories, it's much worse than apartheid, much worse. Just remember, white South Africa needed the black population. They were its workforce, just like the slave states in the South needed the black population. That's the workforce. Can't get rid of them. And if you need, in fact, if you go back to the Civil War, it's worth reading the debates. They're not. I mean, the slave owners had arguments. They thought they were right. you know, and they justified their position. And they had arguments, some of which were never really answered. So, for example, to be anachronistic, if I own a car and you rent the same car, and we come back a year later, which one's going to be in better shape? Well, mine will. Since I own it, I'll take care of it. You don't own it, so you know, if it gets dented or something happens, you won't do anything. Well, that's the slave owner's argument. We own our workforce. You rent them. So we take care of our workforce. You don't. You can just toss them out if you, it's called wage labor. You rent them. You don't want them anymore, you toss them out. You have no responsibility for them. So we're the ones who are moral and you're immoral. Well, you might think about whether there's an answer to that. Anyhow, that's the, that was essentially the South African white stand. We take care of the Bantustans because we need them. And in fact, to some extent they did. There was some development in the Bantustans, partly for this reason, partly because they were trying to make them, you know, enough of a showcase so that the world would recognize them. On the other hand, Israel has absolutely no need or interest in the domestic population in the West Bank. They're perfectly happy to get rid of them all. It's the nuisance, you know. So they don't take care of them, they don't support them. I mean, they're just a nuisance, get rid of them. I mean, they used to use them as a workforce years ago, but that ended quite a while ago. Partly because it ended because of the success of what's called neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is the set of policies that the U.S. and its allies imposed on much of the world through the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization and so on. They're very highly regarded. If you're taking economics courses, they'll tell you how wonderful it is. But in fact, it devastated the societies. And it left a huge number of people in total misery. One of the reasons why there's so much immigration from Mexico, there are others, but that's one. As this plague spread around the world, Israel was able to get very cheap labor from Thailand, you know, Latin America, Romania, you know. Actually, their favorites were from China. There wasn't neoliberalism there, but the favorites, they were even called slave labor, which is virtually what they were, contract labor. They take away their passports, you know, they're under the control of the contractor who brings them in. The beauty of China was that Chinese labor was that if they ever protested, so like maybe they wanted their wages paid or something, you could just call in the Chinese embassy, and the Chinese embassy would lay down the law. You say, you shut up, or we're going to send you back to China, and you know what's going to happen to you there. So that was a nice arrangement. But as long as they have that cheap semi-slave workforce, they don't need Palestinians anymore. If they have Palestinians, they more or less have to take care of them. In any event, in the occupied territories, I think it's a lot worse than apartheid. There was nothing in the Bantustans that's treated, say, like Gaza or even the West Bank. So in two respects, I don't think it's a valid analogy. But there is a valid analogy, I think, namely the one I mentioned. That's almost never discussed because there's one taboo topic in the United States and in the West generally, namely actual power. The actual power of the United States and its allies and the way they run the world, it's kind of taboo. You're not supposed to talk about that. So that's sort of excluded, although it's the core issue, or maybe because it's the core issue.
We're going to take two more.
Thank you. In the last 30 years that I've been involved in this issue, I've seen an enormous increase in public awareness on this question. More op-eds printed, more letters to the editor, even a growth of awareness within the American Jewish community, just incredibly different. 30 years ago, Norman Finkelstein and I spoke here, and we were shouted down. And it's just an incredible difference between, you know, this evening. But nonetheless, even though that has happened, many, many people here have been to the West Bank and Gaza and so on, Congress, no matter what Israel does, invade Lebanon, invade Gaza, build settlements which humiliate our diplomats and so on, and statements like this. Whenever Israel does something outrageous, they have a resolution that comes forward, and everyone votes for it, including our own representative, who's a great guy on all kinds of social issues. And I've met with him and brought him information and whatever. What can we do to reverse this so that somebody like Deval Patrick, for instance, would even have a clue that making a business arrangement, which he just did with Israel, has some moral overtones and political overtones? Nobody would have done that in the 80s with South Africa. They would have known that there was a political cost, or they might have known there was a political cost. What can we do to help that? Because despite the public opinion, members of Congress are overwhelmingly voting, unquestionably for Israel.
Yeah. Well, what you say is absolutely right. I mean,
I've been doing this since the 60s. I mean, not very long ago, I'd have to have police protection. I was giving a talk. And yes, meetings were broken up, and just even a couple of years ago. So yeah, that's changed enormously. But the comparison to South Africa in the 80s is not quite accurate, because by the 80s, even U.S. business was opposed to apartheid. Okay, that Congress was passing resolutions and so on. I mean, you compare it to the 60s or the 50s, it's more like the case of Israel. There's a lot of public opposition to racism, but nothing in public policy. It took a lot of work. There was a lot of organizing, activism, education, and it made a breakthrough. So the first sanctions proposal at a university, at least, as I recall, I think was as late as 1977 at Hampshire, kind of a university that's kind of on the outside. And that was after a long time. And by then, even American corporations were starting to pull out. So, and in fact, what you describe here with regard to the gap, first of all, don't forget, we're not a majority. I mean, you're right that there's a big change, but that's a long way from saying, we speak for the people, It's the Maoist slogans. Got a long way to go. But it's a big change. But just think about American politics. I mean, even where the public is overwhelmingly in favor of something, it almost never affects policy if it harms business interests. Okay, so take, say, healthcare, big issue. I mean, right now we're all supposed to, be worried about how to cut the deficit. And a pretty straightforward way to get rid of the deficit. And any economists who look at this are fully aware of it. You want to get rid of the deficit, establish a healthcare system like other industrial countries. Now, that's not exactly a utopian goal. Every other industrial country has national healthcare systems which have about half the per capita cost of the United States and generally have better outcomes. And don't have tens of thousands of people without insurance. So in fact, I can refer you to the sources if you want, but it's been worked out. If we had the same kind of healthcare system as other industrial countries, we would not only not have a deficit, we'd have a surplus. Is anybody suggesting that? I mean, no, it sounds insane. How can you oppose the insurance companies and the financial corporations? I mean, they're the guys who fund elections. They're the ones who put Obama into office. That's maybe a third of corporate profits. You can't offend them. Doesn't matter what the public wants. I mean, when Obama gave away the public option, and remember, he gave it away without even an effort. That was over the opposition of about close to 2/3 of the population. Did it make any difference? When he made his deal with the pharmaceutical corporations, drug prices in the United States are, 2 or 3 times as high as anywhere else. The reason is that the U.S. is, I think, alone in the world in having a legislative framework which prevents the government from negotiating drug prices. So, of course, they're sky high. Every other country does that. Actually, the U.S. does it, too, for the Veterans Administration. And there, the drug prices are more or less under control. Well, Obama gave that one away, too. There was only one poll about it, but there was 85% opposition. Did it make any difference? No. I mean, if you have a country that's run by concentrations of capital, at the moment it happens to be heavily the financial institutions, as long as you can keep the public quiet, it doesn't matter what they think. And that's true on issue after issue. And furthermore, the public knows it. You take a look at, for years, ever since the Reagan years, there have been regular polls, good polling agencies on where people are asked, who do you think the government works for? And you get figures like about 80% often saying that the government works for the few and the special interests, not for the people. Well, they don't ask who do you mean by special interests, but that would be the next question. But whatever people mean, they're basically correct. And that's one of the reasons, I'm sure, why there's such anger, frustration, hatred of all institutions. I mean, the attitudes toward just about every institution are in, like often single digits, double digits. Well, because people hate everything that's going on, but they don't think they can do anything about it. And what does get done is extremely destructive. But so yeah, you're right about Israel, but it generalizes. We've got a big problem about the democracy deficit in the country. Oh.
Can you hear me? A lot of the issues you talked about have been confirmed in the Palestine papers that have come out recently. Can you talk about how those papers have not been covered in the American media?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Can you discuss why the Palestine papers, which have been published in other countries, have not been covered by American media sources?
Other countries have not been covered?
The Palestine papers, the WikiLeaks-like documents.
The WikiLeaks?
Palestine papers.
Oh, the Palestine papers.
Yeah. Can you speak about why those haven't been covered by American media sources when they have been covered by other sources such as Britain?
Actually, I don't read the British press as carefully as I do here, but I didn't see a lot of coverage of them in the British press. There was some, but not a lot. My feeling on the case of the Palestine papers, personally, I mean, I read them, and they were interesting, but, I thought they were mostly just embarrassing. I mean, what they reflected was the complete desperation on the part of the Palestinians. No matter what they give away, they just get laughed at, and they're desperate. It reflected extreme arrogance on the part of Israel and the United States. So you read the statements of, Condoleezza Rice and the others, they're just full of contempt for the Palestinians. You take what we give you or shut up, basically. Yeah, we sort of know that, and the Palestine papers brought it out kind of graphically, but I didn't see any, maybe I missed it, but I didn't see any real major leaks. Now, there were some of the WikiLeaks documents that did have revealing information, and much of that really didn't get covered. But I just didn't see it in the Palestine papers. Actually, some of what came out in WikiLeaks bears on the question that somebody asked, you did, I think, about U.S. support for Israel. So some of the WikiLeaks documents from, I forget where they came from, listed, actually this report, as far as I could found, only appeared in Israel, listed strategic locations throughout the world, locations that are of very high security concern to the United States, so we must be careful to preserve them. And there were maybe a dozen or so. One of them was right near Haifa, the Rafael military production center, which produces cluster bombs and other advanced materials. Well, okay, U.S. government considers that one of the main strategic sites that we have to protect in the world. And if you look more closely, Rafael, which is Israel's biggest military producer, their military production in Israel is closely linked to the U.S., all integrated. They actually moved a lot of their management facilities to the United States because they have closer, easier contacts with the funders and so on when they're here than when they're in Israel. It's kind of like an offshoot of the United States, a military intelligence high-tech offshoot. So that was interesting. And there are others. There are other important leaks, but at least I didn't see a lot in the Palestine papers other than it was kind of embarrassing. An embarrassment for the Palestinians, and it should have been an embarrassment for us to see the way American leaders are talking to them.
Okay, we'd like to thank everyone for coming. You all enjoyed
I've been asked to say a few words, and I'll try to keep it to a few words on the occupation, just meaning the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and I'll keep to that, omit the Golan Heights, separate but important issue. Just to let you know where I stand on the matter, so no confusion. I think there is a possibility now of a diplomatic settlement, pretty much in accord with what has been a very long-standing and extremely broad international consensus since the mid-1970s, namely a two-state settlement on the recognized international border with minor modifications. That has not been possible for one reason, because the United States has been blocking it since the mid-1970s and continues to block it, but that much is in our hands, so that could change. About 2/3 of the population supports it, but has no effect on policy. The one formulation of that, there are various formulations of this proposal. One of them, the most reasonable one on the table, I think, is the so-called Geneva Accords being discussed in Geneva right now. Most of the relevant countries have lent support to it. The U.S. is notable by its absence, as usual. In my view, this is, I'm not suggesting it's a wonderful agreement. I don't think it is. I think it's the least unpleasant of the realistic alternatives, at least for the short term. Maybe it can lead to something better later on. But that's just so you know where I stand, and you can triangulate as you like. I will review briefly, that's all I'll do, in fact, some of the steps leading up to this. For many of you, this should be familiar. In fact, for everyone, it should be something you learn about in elementary school. So I apologize for saying things that should be at least well known, and would be if we valued our freedom, but unfortunately are not well known, in fact barely known. So let me quickly review. As I said, by occupied territories, I will refer to, take as a starting point, the effective international border as it was settled in 1949. That border what's called the Green Line, divides the Palestinian state that was recommended at the UN resolution 2 years earlier. It divides it roughly in two, almost exactly in two. Half of it was taken over by Israel. That part is called Israel, and it's not under contention. The other half was taken over by Jordan. That's what's called the West Bank, and that's the part that's under contention. So that partition is essentially finished as far as the international community is concerned, and it's not debated. The border stayed that way until Israel invaded in 1956, but was compelled by the U.S. to withdraw. In 1967, Israel again invaded, this time with U.S. support, and conquered the Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. That's the situation as it is now. What I'm referring to now as the occupied territories again are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In November 1967, the Security Council accepted a U.S.-initiated resolution, UN 242, which called for a settlement on the international border, on the Green Line, in the U.S. official version, with minor and mutual adjustments, but essentially on the Green Line, so maybe straighten out a curved border or something like that. That was the U.S. position. It was adopted by essentially the world. Notice that that resolution was completely rejectionist. It said nothing about Palestinian rights. They're not mentioned. The only reference to Palestinians is a vague allusion to unspecified rights of refugees. That remained, at that time, in 1967, the resolution it called essentially for peace, full peace treaty in return for full withdrawal, minor modifications and mutual ones. Israel rejected the withdrawal. The major Arab states rejected peace. Things were at a standstill until 1971, when Egypt broke the ice by offering Israel a full peace treaty, complete peace treaty in terms of official U.S. policy, in return not for withdrawal but for partial withdrawal, that is, withdrawal from Egyptian territory. The Egyptian offer said nothing about the West Bank, about the Palestinians, the Golan Heights. It said in return for withdrawal from Egyptian territory, Egypt would accept a full peace treaty. Egypt is the major military force in the Arab world. With Egypt out of the conflict, the military aspect of the conflict would have essentially been over. Israel understood that we have a lot of Israeli internal documents from the period, some of them secret then, some public, and they're consistent. They understood that there could be full peace at this point and integration into the region, but Israel decided to reject the offer because they preferred expansion. Expansion at that time meant into the Sinai. That was the crucial area. This is a labor government, Golda Meir labor government, was expanding into the northeast Sinai, from which thousands of the farmers had been expelled, driven into the desert behind barbed wire, their towns, mosques, and so on, leveled in preparation for the building of an all-Jewish city called Yamit, which was a major project at the time. The crucial question was how the United States would react, as always. The United States is what one astute Israeli commentator, one of their major political commentators, really recently described as the boss man called partner, which is essentially accurate. So the question is how the boss man called partner would react. The boss man had an internal debate. It was won by Henry Kissinger, and the U.S. government decided to abandon its former position and accept Israel's position, and to follow what Kissinger called a policy of stalemate. Stalemate means no negotiations, just force. That ended the Egyptian initiative. Actually, Egypt continued to put it forward in every way it could. The President Sadat of Egypt, who had initiated it, warned repeatedly that if Israel continued expanding into the Sinai with U.S. backing, he would go to war. In his phrase, Yamit means war. Nobody took him very seriously. It was a period of enormous triumphalism in both Israel and the United States. Egypt was assumed to be a basket case, and it was just disregarded. In 1973, to everyone's astonishment, Egypt did go to war, and to everyone's greater astonishment, turned out to be militarily highly successful. It was a very close thing for Israel. In fact, for the world, the United States declared a nuclear alert, and it was pretty tense could have been a superpower conflict, meaning the end. At that point, Kissinger recognized that Egypt can't simply be dismissed, and he initiated what was called his shuttle diplomacy, moving up and back and trying to arrange some sort of ceasefire. Without going through the details, that led finally to the Camp David agreements of 1978, in which the United States and Israel accepted Sadat's 1971 offer. Except that at that point, the offer was much less acceptable to the U.S. and Israel than it would have been in 1971, because by then the Palestinian issue was on the table. So the new Sadat offer in 1978 was that Egypt would make peace with Israel if Israel withdrew from Egyptian territory, Sinai, and also recognized Palestinian rights. That was new, not in 1971. The way this is described in the United States, it's called, and in fact in the West, thanks to the power of U.S. propaganda, it's described as a diplomatic triumph of the United States. In fact, President Carter just got a Nobel Peace Prize for it recently. Actually, it was a diplomatic catastrophe for the United States. It was an acceptance of a harsher version, from their point of view, of an offer that was on the table in 1971, which Washington had rejected, leading to a major war, almost destruction, years of tragedy and torture, and finally the U.S. Came around and accepted it. But history is written by the victors and the powerful. It doesn't necessarily have much relationship to what happened. You can check and see if you agree that that's what happened. And there's not really any controversy. The documentary record is very straightforward. By 1978, as I mentioned, by 1978, the Palestinian issue was on the table. That reached the international agenda in 1976, January 1976, when the Security Council debated a resolution calling for a political settlement on the international border, but now different from UN 242, because it called for a Palestinian state in the territories that Israel would evacuate, the West Bank and Gaza. There was a very broad international support for that. It was supported by all the Arab states, major Arab states, by the PLO, in fact, pretty much by the whole world. The U.S. vetoed it. A U.S. veto typically is a double veto. It doesn't happen, and it's vetoed from history. So you have to work hard to find out about it. That was the first overt U.S. step to block the international consensus, which still persists. Same international consensus, same blocking. Well, I won't run through the rest of the record, but from that point until the present, the United States has continued to intervene unilaterally, vetoing Security Council resolutions, voting against similar General Assembly resolutions, usually alone. Alone means with Israel, sometimes with the Marshall Islands or someone else who's picked up, but essentially unilaterally, and has also blocked all other initiatives. There have been a whole series of diplomatic initiatives, all blocked by Washington. That continues to the present. In 1991, just to move to the next step in the diplomacy, after the first Gulf War, the U.S. felt that it was in a position to, it had made it clear in the First Gulf War that the U.S. was going to dominate that region by force. Everybody else understood, everybody backed off. The U.S. was in a position to ram through its own unilateral agreement, so it assumed. The Madrid conference right after the Gulf War was called to institute the U.S. position. There was, however, a snag. There was an authentic Palestinian delegation headed by the most respected figure in the occupied territories, Haider Abdel Shafi, a conservative, nationalist, honest, renowned for his integrity and highly respected, and he simply refused to go along. He headed the Palestinian negotiation team, and they simply refused to accept the U.S.-Israeli demand that a settlement, a political settlement, permit continued Israeli, U.S.-backed Israeli moves to settle and integrate as much of the occupied territories as they wanted. That was the point on which the negotiations blocked. They got around that thanks to the Palestinian leadership outside Palestine. It's called the Tunis leadership, the PLO and Yasser Arafat, who decided to undercut the Palestinian negotiating team and agree to a political arrangement which would permit continued Israeli settlement. That means U.S.-funded and backed Israeli settlement in the occupied territories and further integration, building infrastructure, and so on. That was called the Oslo Agreement, highly praised here. Grand meeting on the White House lawn, the day of awe, according to the Boston Globe. If you read the terms of the Oslo Agreement, the Declaration of Principles, it was completely obvious what was happening. The terms did refer to UN 242, but they left out all other UN resolutions which called for Palestinian national rights. Remember, UN 242 is completely rejectionist, nothing about the Palestinians. So the Declaration of Principles described the permanent settlement, the long-term settlement that they were going to reach, as based solely on UN 242, hence offering nothing to the Palestinians. And there was nothing in it about any bar to continued U.S.-backed Israeli settlement and integration programs in the occupied territories. The Palestinians did have a role. The Palestinian Authority was set up. Its role, as Prime Minister Rabin pointed out with great pleasure, was its role would be to control the Palestinian population by force and violence and terror. Could be as brutal as it wanted, as corrupt as it wanted, didn't matter, as long as it kept the Palestinians under control. As Rabin put it in his usual gentle way, they would be able to control the Palestinians without concern for human rights organizations, the Israeli High Court, mothers and fathers who don't like what's happening, what their children are doing, and so on and so forth. Standard colonial procedure. It's very familiar in the history of colonialism. The imperial colonies are almost always run by collaborators, not by the imperial country. Collaborators run the political system, run security forces. One of the shocking things about the American occupation of Iraq is that it hasn't been able to duplicate, amazingly, what almost every military occupation does quite easily. Very surprising. Anyway, that was the role of the Palestinian Authority. So things continued through the 1990s with continued steady Israeli, US-backed Israeli settlement and development programs. The year 2000, the last Clinton-Barak year, actually had the highest level of settlement since before the Oslo agreements. It was continuing steadily and in fact increasing. And that's the core, has been the core of the territorial problem. There are other problems, but the keeping just to the occupation, it's a territorial issue, and that's the core of it. Camp David, there was another Camp David meeting in summer of 2000 where proposals were made. They were very highly praised in the United States as extremely magnanimous and generous and marvelous offer, which the Palestinians turned down because they want to kill all the Jews or something like this. There's a very easy way to test that thesis, which was essentially unanimous in U.S. Journalism and commentary. The easy way to test the thesis is to look at a map. It seems obvious. If it's a magnanimous, generous offer, then the map ought to show it. Well, that's not so easy, it turns out, because no one has been able to find a single map in the entire U.S. media. It's not that they were hard to find. I mean, they're available in the standard scholarly sources, which the press and commentators use when they want to. They were there in the Israeli press. They were there in critical literature. If you came to talks of mine and others, we described the maps. So they were there. They just weren't presented. The reason why they weren't presented is that it's pretty clear when you look at them. The generous offer broke the West Bank into essentially 3 separated cantons, a northern, central, and southern one, divided from one another by Israeli settlement and huge infrastructure projects. All 3 of them pretty much separated, virtually separated from a small part of Jerusalem, the 4th West Bank canton. That's traditionally the center of Palestinian commercial, cultural life, health services, and so on. So 4 West Bank enclaves separated from Gaza, the future of which was unclear. So that's what many mainstream Israeli commentators rightly called a kind of a Bantustan settlement, referring to the South African model, which was in fact a conscious model, I should say. Well, you know, magnanimous from some points of view, not from others. Just to be fair to Clinton and Barak, one should say that it was a considerable improvement over the existing situation. The existing situation was that Gaza was split into 3 separate regions, 3 separate Palestinian cantons, and the West Bank was separated into 227 cantons. Little areas, some a few square kilometers, basically closed off. And this was going to improve it to 4 cantons in the West Bank and presumably 1 in Gaza. So it was an improvement. It's worth remembering that 227 and 3, because the current roadmap, you know, of the quartet, it's usually called the U.S. roadmap, calls for, out in the distance sometime, a return to the status quo as of 2000. So therefore, it's interesting to remember what the status quo was in 2000. 227 Palestinian cantons in the West Bank and 3 in Gaza. That obviously wasn't going to go anywhere. However, negotiations did continue. After the Intifada broke out shortly after, negotiations continued in Taba, in Egyptian city in Taba, in 2001, in January. There were informal but high-level negotiations between Palestinian and Israeli negotiators, and they reached a tentative agreement, which is available if you're interested in the Israeli press and the European press. I've don't think there's any, never seen any discussion of it in the United States, except again around the periphery, dissident literature. There's a detailed description of it by the European Union Observer, which is accurate. It was accepted by both sides, published in the mainstream Israeli press, and it's a clear improvement over the impossible Geneva Accords. There were still points of disagreement, territorial points about, Israeli salients breaking up the West Bank and so on, but it was a step towards a more equitable resolution of the territorial problem. Well, that was terminated. Those negotiations were terminated by Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak right before the Israeli elections. It was thought that that ended it. We've recently learned that the negotiations continued, and they lead up to the Geneva Accords. If you take a look at the Geneva Accords, again, here you can occasionally find something looking like a map. They are a considerable improvement over the Taba proposals, which were themselves a very substantial improvement over Camp David. You could look at the details. That's essentially what's on the table now. It could be, I think, to go back to where I started, the basis for a serious political settlement that it would at least end the cycle of violence and maybe lay the basis for something better in the future. Is it just? No, it's not just. For one reason, Israel, incidentally, abandons nothing in the Geneva Accords, zero. To be precise, it abandons a little strip of territory along the Gaza Strip, which is not very important. And in return, it takes over a piece of the West Bank. But it abandons nothing in the, that's to which it's legally entitled, at least. The Palestinians do abandon quite a bit. They abandon a stretch of the West Bank. And crucially, a large section of the Palestinians are not represented at all, namely the refugees. They're not part of these negotiations. And their rights are essentially dismissed, several million people. So, in terms of justice, probably you can make all kind of criticisms of it. I should say many old friends of mine and longtime associates have signed protests against it, which I don't agree with, because I think my own view again, and I'll stop with this, that of the realistic possibilities, it's about the only one that has any chance of being implemented. In some other universe, one could think of other things, but people who are suffering and miserable and tortured can't live with promises of some other universe. They have to have solutions in this universe, at least in my view. Anyhow, that's where things stand now and how they got there as I understand it. So let me stop and turn it to you.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I would like to now present Professor Chomsky with the traditional Jordanian headscarf as a token of our appreciation. Recently, people have been associating these headscarves with terrorists and terrorism. This is unfortunate, and we would hope to fight this stereotype and reassociate these headscarves with their true cultural significance. I would now like to open the floor for questions.
It's a long story. I've written a lot about it, so let me just refer you to what I've written, and then I'll just briefly summarize. So I've been writing about it for 40 years as internal documents have been coming out, and we get a clearer picture of it. There's a summary, at least the way I understand it, in a book of mine that just came out a couple of weeks ago called Hegemony or Survival. One of the chapters is about this, and it reviews what I think the record shows In brief, it seems to me it's roughly like this. In 1948, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the U.S. military, was very impressed with Israel's military prowess and described them as Israel as the most powerful military force in the Middle East, second only to Turkey. Turkey was really the base of U.S. power and remains so, the main military force. And they said, well, sooner or later, we might want to think about Israel as a base for U.S., part of the U.S. system of control. What the U.S. is concerned about in the Middle East is no secret. It has the world's major energy resources, period. If it wasn't for that, it could go down the tube. And when the oil is finished, it will go down the tube unless something is done. These are serious internal problems for the Arab world, I should say. But as far as the United States is concerned, what's important is to control the oil. The U.S. at that time, in the mid-40s, State Department described the Persian Gulf resources as what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history, the most important area in the world for foreign investment. Not a small thing, kind of important, even more so today. And the method of control of the oil resources was essentially taken over from the British. British had been the primary imperial power. U.S. was a secondary player up until the Second World War. The British, and secondarily the French, mostly controlled that region. The British technique was to establish what they called an Arab facade. That meant weak, pliable governments which would control their own populations. And behind the scenes, behind what the British called various constitutional fictions, like democracy and freedom and parliament and so on, behind those constitutional fictions, the British would effectively rule. But the Arab facade would run it. Again, the standard imperial pattern. Pretty much what the U.S. is trying to institute in Iraq right now. It's almost copying the British model. France was a secondary power in the region. After the Second World War, the U.S. simply kicked France out on the legalistic grounds that France was an enemy country because it had been conquered by the Germans, and therefore its concessions were removed. You can do that if you're powerful. So France was kicked out. Britain was slowly reduced to the level of junior partner, and the U.S. took it over, but essentially with the British framework, Arab facades. The United States, however, introduced another level of control, what were called peripheral states, non-Arab states, which would be what the Nixon administration later called local cops on the beat. They were police headquarters would be in Washington, of course, and kind of a branch office in London, but the local cops on the beat would be the military powers around the Gulf region. One of them was Turkey. That was the main one, still the main one. Another was Iran. After they succeeded in overthrowing the parliamentary regime in Iran in 1953 and reinstituting a dictatorship, Iran was the second major cop on the beat. And the question was, Pakistan played a role, and the question was, would Israel be one of them? And that's been the issue. Well, in 1958, there was a long step towards that. There was a very, I won't go into it in detail, but it was a very important year in the Middle East, and in fact in the world, 1958. Iraq broke out of the Anglo-American condominium. There was a military coup in Iraq, and it took over its own oil resources. There was deep concern in London and Washington. The British military base was Jordan, looked as if it was under threat. The U.S. sent military forces to Lebanon, apparently equipped with nuclear weapons. The concern was that Nasser of Egypt, who was the nationalist symbol, was influencing independent nationalism in the region. The only country in the region that offered any support to the U.S. and Britain at the time was Israel. Turkey, of course, but that's taken for granted. Turkey and Iran are taken for granted. But right in the region, Israel did offer some support. The President Eisenhower and the National Security Council in 1958 internally concluded that, as they put it, a logical corollary of opposition to Arab nationalism is support for Israel as the only reliable base internal to the region, part of the periphery system. In 1967, that was just solidified. I mean, when Israel conquered, essentially it destroyed Nasser, who was the main concern of the U.S., and that was considered a great gift to U.S. power and to the facade. It was a defense of the oil monarchies against nationalism. And from then on, it's just continued. Israel's been regarded as what's called a strategic asset. In the early 70s, U.S. intelligence regarded the structure of the region, of U.S. power in the region, as based on a local tripartite alliance between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, with Turkey right in the background. Leading U.S. political figures who were concerned with the region, like Senator Jackson, expressed the same views. In 1959, the Shah was overthrown. Iran went off, became an enemy, and that just meant the role of Israel was more important. And in fact, the Israeli-Turkish alliance is extremely close. It was founded in 1958, a military alliance, that fateful year, and it's now Israel's strongest alliance after the United States, part of the whole framework of control. By now, Israel's become virtually a U.S. military base. It's got the most, it's a little country, small country, but it has extremely powerful military forces. It has hundreds of nuclear weapons, other weapons of mass destruction. It's, according to its own military sources, its air and armored forces are larger and technologically more advanced than any NATO power outside the U.S. So it's no small thing. It's tightly linked to the United States in terms of its economy, kind of a high-tech, military-based economy, really closely interlinked with the U.S. It's coming to mimic the United States in other respects. It was at one point a relatively egalitarian, more or less social democratic society, kind of Scandinavian type social democracy. That's all completely gone. It's now, like the United States, has the highest inequality in the industrial world after the United States. Social systems collapsing, like in the United States, and in other respects, it's becoming similar to the boss man called partner, not surprisingly. But I think that's the core of the issue. I mean, there are other things, there are other factors, but in my view, at least, that's been the core of it. Okay, so his very reasonable question is that I said before that I think the current Geneva Accords, as they're called, the ones under discussion in Geneva, are the least bad, or maybe the best, the best plan that can be implemented. Why did I have the opposite view about the Oslo agreements, Camp David and Taba? That's the question. Well, the reason is that these are the first agreements, the first proposals that do not institute effectively Bantustans in the occupied territories. The Oslo agreements in 1993 essentially offered the Palestinians nothing. As I mentioned, they didn't even mention Palestinian rights. And over the Oslo years, if you look at the successive agreements, again, I've written a lot about it, others have too, they simply institutionalized Israeli control over the occupied territories. When I say Israeli, I mean U.S.-backed Israeli. Israel can't do anything without U.S. backing. The Camp David Accords, as I mentioned, I think were a disaster. Taba agreements were somewhat better, but they still had those, they never resolved the issue. If you look at the Taba agreements, they never resolved the issue of the Israeli salients, the settlement salients that effectively broke the West Bank into three parts. It was left unresolved at the end of the Taba agreements. These proposals actually do offer a resolution. You can debate whether you like the resolution, but at least, it's it would lead to a territorial division that allows for a degree of independence, subsidiary independence, no doubt. All of these proposals establish what Ehud Barak's chief negotiator, Shlomo Ben-Ami, an Israeli academic, described as the goal of the Oslo Accords, namely a permanent neo-colonial dependency for the Palestinians. In one form or another, they all have that character. That's part of the injustice. But unfortunately, my view, that's at the moment, it's a fact of life. Until the United States and other international forces modify their position on this, I don't think anything more just can be attained. This is pretty much in our hands, incidentally. As I mentioned, the U.S. population, just to give you an indication of U.S. public opinion, which is rarely reported in the United States because it's too opposed to U.S. government policy, but the U.S. public is about 2/3 in favor of what's called the Saudi plan, which means total Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, none of this shenanigans around the border, in turn for peace. By a very substantial majority, also about 2-to-1, the public thinks that the United States ought to terminate aid to either of the two parties, either Israel or the Palestinians, which is not negotiating in good faith to achieve a political settlement. And if both parties are negotiating, the U.S. ought to equalize aid to them. Well, if any of you are familiar with the actual aid flow, I mean, this is a radical revision of U.S. policy. I mean, just a total revision of it. In fact, U.S. public opinion is so extreme on this matter that these facts can't even be reported, and they aren't. So even though they come from the major academic-based polling agency in the United States, Program on International Policy Attitudes at University of Maryland, very detailed, in-depth studies, which are quoted when they give tolerable results, but not here. And in fact, that means that people who have these attitudes probably think they're isolated. They probably think I'm the only person in the country who believes this because you don't know that other people do. Well, all of that is important because it means there is a basis, a popular basis for developing political pressures that could lead to a political settlement, could shift U.S. unilateral rejection of even the Geneva Accords. But it has to be done. It's not going to happen by itself. Well, actually, I haven't read the book, and to tell you the honest truth, I haven't read anything of his since for the last 30 years. Ever since he was publicly exposed, very publicly, in the Boston Globe, as a liar and a fraud and a fanatic opponent of civil rights. It's all in print. I can give it to you if you like, but since then I frankly haven't bothered. The question was, have I read Alan Dershowitz's book, and what do I think about what he said about me? And, yeah. All right, that was, as far as I was concerned, that was settled 30 years ago, and I haven't really bothered since. It's astonishing to me that he's able to survive the publication of what happened then. You can look at it if you like, but if you like, I'll describe it to you. The book itself, I've seen parts of because people sent me pieces, and it's just complete fraud. I mean, not even worth discussing. I don't like to give general comments without details in front of me, but if you can think of anything that ought to be commented on, I'd like to hear it. Yeah.
He especially attacked or actually claimed that he could use historians that you rely on, such as Morris, to disprove your points.
Yeah. Well, actually, he's referring to, it's interesting what he does there, at least what was sent to me. I assume what was sent to me by several people, including his associates, was accurate. It's all the same. He quotes something from a talk that I gave at Harvard about a year ago. He doesn't quote from the talk, which is about a totally different... First of all, quoting from a talk is already childish and ridiculous. Nobody does it, especially when a ton of material's in print. But he didn't quote from the talk. He quoted from the Q&A, which is even more ridiculous. He quoted a comment that I made about Benny Morris. in the Q&A, which was, of course, from memory, wasn't part of the talk. Turns out the quote was almost a word-for-word paraphrase of what Morris actually said. Okay, so what he quoted was a comment of mine in informal Q&A referring to Benny Morris, and in fact, almost precise, so close to accurate, it could have been in a scholarly article and no one would have noticed it. It wasn't a quote, of course, it was a paraphrase, but it happened to be almost verbatim. And that's what he says he can refute, citing Benny Morris. And I'll give you the wording if you like, but that's the way it continues. It's a joke. Well, the question had to do with Russian policy throughout this whole period and the U-turn in it in recent years. Actually, there's been no U-turn. Russian policy throughout this period was right in the heart of the international consensus. I mean, there's all kinds of issues you could talk about, but of the issues that I've been discussing, the diplomacy, Russia was no different from Western Europe as far as the diplomacy was concerned. They supported the international consensus since the mid-1970s. They continued to support it. Brezhnev put forth his own plan, which was approximately identical, and they backed all the UN resolutions. They were right in the core of the international consensus, and they still are. I mean, there is a change in policy, but in lots of ways, but not on the diplomacy of the Middle East. I mean, because there really hasn't been any change in the international position. Slight modifications, but the international position, which has just been an overwhelming consensus, has been pretty stable. It's been blocked by the United States, but no one else. But doesn't exert much pressure. I mean, it did support the Arab states. So it supported the Arab states militarily. It gave some tepid support to the Palestinians, not amounting to much. That's part of the Cold War. If the United States militarily supports one side, the Russians support the other, and so on. But it had almost nothing to do with the diplomacy. Israeli military power was backed by the U.S. and Turkey and so on. It was just overwhelming. As I mentioned, by now Israel was more powerful than any NATO power. It's not Russia, but England, France, etc. Well, I mean, there are unpleasant things going on in the United States and internal to Israel, but by comparative standards, by world standards, the United States and Israel for Jews are both very free societies. So we're not under, you don't have to be afraid of the police when you walk outside.
I'm saying for certain communities.
Yeah, sure, for marginalized communities, true, but that's always been true. In fact, it's been much worse in the past. I mean, look, it's not good now. A lot of terrible things are happening now. So what's happening, say, under the Patriot Act, it should not be tolerated in a democratic society. On the other hand, we should also be realistic. By comparative standards, either to the rest of the world or even to recent U.S. history, it's not out of sight. I mean, the programs of internal repression that ran through the Kennedy to Nixon administrations were much more serious than what's happening now. They're also not reported much because it's the wrong story, but COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which was run by the National Political Police, the FBI, from Kennedy, actually started under Eisenhower, mainly Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon until it was finally stopped by the courts, was, theoretically at least, was far more severe repression than anything that exists now. I mean, it went all the way to political assassination. It was really no joke. And even that didn't begin to compare with Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare, which was incomparably worse than either of them. So there has been a general improvement. I mean, Ashcroft would doubtless like to drive it back, and there's plenty of things that should not be tolerated. But the repression is restricted in the United States to highly vulnerable people. Of course, that's not a compliment, but and it shouldn't be tolerated. But it's realistic, and by comparison with other parts of the world, it's hardly repression. And for Jews in Israel, it's the same. For Palestinians, of course, it's a vicious and harsh military occupation, as it's been for 35 years. I mean, it's different than it was in earlier years. So going to be more black faces in Harvard and MIT than there were 30 years ago. On the other hand, if you take a look at the prison population, I mean, it's just outrageous. A huge part of the black and Latino population are simply thrown into jail. That's mainly what the drug wars are about. It's a device for getting rid of superfluous people by tossing them into jail. And that certainly should not be tolerated. But again, if you go back, say, to 30 years, 35 years, COINTELPRO reached the point of literally assassinating black organizers, assassinating them. Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed in a Chicago police raid set up by the FBI, probably drugged, murdered another guy too, and nobody cared. In fact, I went to his funeral in Chicago. I think I was one of about 10 white faces in a huge black audience, and nobody cared. In fact, probably very few even know about it, because that was just what you do to people. And that's not the only case. It happens to be the worst case, but that's not happening now. Bad things are, but not that. This had to do with the assassination and the use of force by U.S. forces in Iraq and borrowings from Israel. That's been reported in the press in the last couple of days, the U.S. press and the British press, that U.S. government denies it, but reports are that they're getting Israeli intelligence to help them out with control of the population. Frankly, I tend to think that the U.S. government denials are probably accurate. The reason is that these kinds of vicious tactics are just second nature to military forces anyway. They don't have to get advice from anyone. It's not that there's some sophisticated techniques that we couldn't think of in 10 minutes. There was a limited number of ways of controlling people by violence. So maybe the denials are accurate, but it's probable that they're interacting. If you want to know what it is, they're telling you straight out, so there's nothing for me to say. There was a front page story, the lead story in the New York Times 3 or 4 days ago, a couple of days ago, was by Dexter Filkins. And, well, you read it yourself, but to me it came straight out, it seemed it was coming straight out of the Nazi archives. It quoted U.S. military officers as saying, the Arab mind understands only force and honor or something, and went on to say the way you have to control these people is by showing them that you can use force and crush them, and then they'll respect you. Well, that's very familiar. You're all Harvard students. You've read history. You know exactly what page of history it comes from. Putting aside the Nazi archives, it comes straight out of the British Empire. Take a look at the Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, I've got the edition that was given to me on my bar mitzvah, so it's an old edition. It's 1939. But if you look at the 1939 edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you look at the section on India, it's written by some British military officer who describes how the Punjabis, the military caste in India, enjoyed being beaten up. And when the British beat the shit out of them, they really respected the British for that. And after that, they kind of, followed what the British wanted. You think I'm exaggerating? Look it up. It doesn't say beat the shit out of, but other than that, it approximately says that. And that's the standard view about the natives. What you have to do is smash them in the face. They don't understand anything. They're barbarians. They like force. They love force, and they respect force. And when you do that, you got them under control. That's the Arab mind. If something like that were said about the Jewish mind on the front page of the New York Times, the country would explode. But when you say it about the Arab mind, it's okay. In fact, you can find distinguished Harvard professors who write things not very different from that, and nobody cares. So yes, the tactics are familiar. If they're getting them from Israel, I don't know, maybe they are, but it's mostly second nature to conquerors. So suppose let's see if I understood it. If the United States secured its own resources, what would its strategy be in the region? Exactly the same as it is now, because it has nothing to do with U.S. access to those resources. And if you think about the history, you'll see that. I started from 1945, when the U.S. took over the region because it was a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. Well, that would remain true if at that time the United States was North America was the major oil producer in the world. The U.S. wasn't using those resources. In fact, the U.S. remained North America, that includes the Gulf and so on, was the major oil producer until I think around 1970. But it still had to maintain control of those resources. This is control, not access. If you look at U.S. intelligence projections, contemporary U.S. intelligence projections for the next 15 years or so, they're public and worth looking at. They predict that the Persian Gulf will be even more important in the future. In fact, it'll provide about 2/3 of world energy resources in the next roughly 15 years, but the U.S. won't rely on them. They say the U.S. itself will rely on more stable West Atlantic Basin resources, like West Africa. It's one of the reasons for the concern and intervention in West Africa and the Western Hemisphere. Again, that's one of the reasons for the concern about the turmoil in the Andes, which are sort of getting out of control and a very likely target of U.S. military intervention, because that's regarded as one of the potential major energy resources. But even if the U.S., so they themselves are expecting to rely on resources that are less hazardous, more stable, but they still want to control the most stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. In fact, if the U.S. went to renewable energy tomorrow, I don't think policy would change. This is a lever of world control. You control the Gulf energy resources, you pretty much control the world. And the material prize means huge profits. I mean, again, read this morning's, I think, front page of the New York Times. Yeah, front page. There's a story on how Halliburton is gouging you and your parents by charging ludicrous prices to import Kuwaiti oil into Iraq, about twice as much as Iraq and Kuwait pay. Yeah, that's a great material prize. It yields what one major historian of the oil industry called profits beyond the dream of avarice. And it still does for the future. That's even if we use renewable energy. And the stupendous source of strategic power remains. Controlling the world is not an easy business. It's a tough job for those guys in Washington. The international society is not dominated by the United States. From an economic point of view, the United States is just one of a number of equals. Europe's approximately like the United States. Northeast Asia has a greater gross domestic product than the U.S. does, considerably greater, about 50% greater, and holds about half of U.S. of global foreign exchange, and is the most dynamic region in the world. Also has resources. Actually, Laura Tyson, who was chair of the Council on Economic Advisors under Clinton, just described, a couple days ago, described the world economy briefly, very succinctly, in 4 words. He said the world economy is based on the principle that America spends, Asia lends. And that's more or less accurate. And that's a very fragile situation. There's only one dimension in which the U.S. is overwhelmingly dominant, namely violence. That's why the Bush administration, which happens to be rather extreme, but it's not a pretty narrow spectrum, does want the world to be organized on the basis of force. It makes very good sense, You play your strong card, and the strong card for the United States is force. not economy, not culture, not other things. It's force. The U.S. spends roughly about as much as the rest of the world combined in military force, and is technologically far more advanced. Right now at the United Nations, if we had something like a free press in the country, what you'd be reading on the front page is what's going on at the General Assembly right now. Every day, there's debates on the disarmament committee, the UN Disarmament Committee on Disarmament and International Security, or some such name, is having its meetings right now. And as usual, year after year, this goes on unreported. The world is trying to block the militarization of space and the increase of nuclear weapons, and the U.S. is preventing it. That went on under Clinton. It's going on now. The U.S. is moving on to militarization of space, which is extremely hazardous, may destroy all of us. It's no joke. Right after the U.S. announced the National Security Strategy in September 2002, and the invasion of Iraq, same time, 2 months later, the Space Command publicly announced its plans for the next, 10 or 15 years, in which it said that the U.S. will move from control of space to ownership of space. Well, those of you who've read the National Security Strategy know what that means. We don't just control the world, we own it. And space we're going to own, which means nobody else gets near it. It's going to be used for platforms for offensive weapons, highly destructive weapons, nuclear, non-nuclear. They've adopted a first strike doctrine. The world's under complete surveillance. Hypersonic drones tell you if somebody's crossing the street in, Delhi or something like that. In theory, what's being worked on are systems which would enable a command post in the Colorado mountains to instantaneously attack and destroy any target in the world without warning, and they hope with impunity. Reduces the need for forward military bases, which cause various problems. People don't like them. That's, sitting right there. So yes, the dimension of force is the dominant dimension, and the control over energy resources is a crucial part of this. 50 years ago, George Kennan, one of the top planners then, pointed out that control over Middle East oil gives the United States what he called veto power over, he was thinking of Japan at the time, but in fact everyone. A lot of the maneuvering in the Middle East and Central Asia, if you really look at it closely, is about the direction in which the pipelines will go and who's going to control production and transit routes. And that has to do with controlling Europe and Asia, Northeast Asia particularly, who understand it perfectly well. So they've been looking for their own independent access to energy resources all along. A lot of the maneuvering is about that. Again, in this morning's New York Times, you can read Paul Wolfowitz's memo saying that Germany and France will not be permitted to take part in what's called the reconstruction of Iraq. Well, partly that's just a reflection of the unbelievably passionate hatred of democracy by Wolfowitz and the Bush administration and others like them. I mean, they're furious at France and Germany because France and Germany, the governments took the same position as the overwhelming majority of the population, so therefore they have to be punished. The good guys like Italy and Spain, the government overruled an even larger majority of the population, so they got to be rewarded. It's kind of intriguing about the U.S. intellectual community that this can go on alongside of, odes to the love of democracy of Paul Wolfowitz and so on. So part of it is just the normal hatred of democracy, but it's more than that. France and Germany are the heartland of Europe. That's the industrial, commercial, financial heart of Europe. And if they get access to the Middle East, that's no good. Because then they won't be under the thumb of the United States. We need that veto power. So go back to your question, we shift to renewable energy. I don't think anything would change. Who would the Palestinian leaders be with the greatest chance of negotiation success? Well, in my view, that's up to the Palestinians to decide, right? And the Palestinians have decided. I mean, when Bush made his speech about democracy that we were all supposed to worship a couple of weeks ago, it was mostly ridiculed in the Middle East and, in fact, most of the world outside of England for very simple reasons. If you look at what he said, he praised various democracies. You know, these countries are advancing toward democracy. These are not so good, and so on. It had absolutely nothing to do with democracy. Anybody who knows about the countries knows no correlation. But it had a very good correlation to willingness to accept U.S. orders. So if you were following U.S. orders, you were progressing toward democracy, just kind of like Italy and Spain, as distinct from France and Germany. But what's striking about the Middle East is that there is one elected leader. There's one genuinely elected leader in the region, one, elected by supervised elections. You know, probably not perfect, but I doubt that they were worse than the 2000 elections. Who did they elect? Well, Yasser Arafat. He's the one elected leader in the region. So what does the Bush administration have to say about him? Out, you know. That's because of our love of democracy and our grand vision about democracy. I mean, I don't like him personally. I wouldn't have voted for him, but it's not up to me, you know, that he was elected by the Palestinians. If you want to know which leader should negotiate, well, you know, let the Palestinians pick a leadership. They've already done it. Let them pick another one. But let them do it, not Washington, not Paul Wolfowitz or other people whose contempt for democracy goes beyond discussion. Let them do it themselves. I think there are better choices, but you know, who am I to say? It's there for them to say. And in fact, as far as Arafat is concerned, whatever you think about him, he has, by comparison, on these issues, by comparison with American or Israeli leaders, he's been far more willing to accept a diplomatic settlement. In fact, that's been considered the problem. Ever since the mid-'70s, he's been pressing for a political settlement. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, with U.S. backing again, otherwise they couldn't have done it, and killed about 20,000 people and destroyed most of the South. It had nothing to do with self-defense. They didn't even pretend that it did. It had to do with getting rid of the PLO, which was becoming Arafat, as one of Israel's leading scholar on the Palestinians put it, very conservative guy, no doubt. Yehoshua Porat, he said that Arafat's insistence on diplomacy and negotiations are what he called a veritable catastrophe for Israel. So we got to put an end to it and return them to terror, which we like, but not negotiations, which we don't want. It was a war for the West Bank, it was called by the highest political and military echelons. Because they were pressing for a political settlement. The U.S. and Israel didn't want it. So if you want somebody to negotiate for a diplomatic settlement, well, you know, there's a choice. I mean, the people who the Palestinians elected, who happens to have been trying to do it for the last, since the mid-'70s. My choice? No, but it's not up to me to decide. So the comment is that since 9/11, Israel has framed its actions in the context of the war on terror. So anything it does is part of the U.S. war against terror, right? And the question is, how would that framing of the issues, how would it affect U.S. government policy? Well, actually, U.S. government policy is so, like every state, is so completely hypocritical that it doesn't make any difference. But and the U.S. is not alone in this respect. But the framing, you're correct about the framing, but remember, it's not Israel. It's just about every country in the world. So Russia, for example, was carrying out vicious atrocities in Chechnya, immediately reconstructed what it was doing as part of the war on terror, figuring they'd get a pat in the head from Washington, which they did. So the U.S. now supports openly the Russian monstrous atrocities in Chechnya. And every other government in the world did approximately the same thing. I mean, Israel and the West Bank, Indonesia and Aceh, everywhere. Other governments like the United States or England, and in fact most, instituted some kind of repressive legislation to control their own populations, usually called Protection Against Terrorism Acts or Patriot Act or something like that. Had almost nothing to do with terrorism, had a lot to do with population control. So yes, the natural response of any power system, any state, to September 11th was to increase its power and repression under the pretext of defense against terror, and Israel did the same thing. But it's across the board. You have to look hard to find an exception. Is Israel defending itself against terror? Well, take a look. Every day there's an article about the separation wall, right? This wall that's snaking through the West Bank. The Security Council and the General Assembly have tried to block it. U.S. stops it, vetoes it as usual. And the justification, it's leaving a couple 100,000 Palestinians essentially in limbo. They're deprived of their lands. They'll have to get out. Sooner or later they'll get out. One of the leading Israeli commentators, Amir Haas, describes it as a step towards expulsion, which probably is. It's described as needed for protection of Israel, for security. Is it? Think about it for a second. Think about it for 1 second. Suppose you wanted to build a wall to protect Israel. Where would you put it? Well, you'd put it a couple of miles inside Israel. If you put a wall a couple of miles inside the Green Line, you could build it 100 feet high if you want. You could have the Israeli army patrolling on both sides. You could mine it with nuclear weapons. You could do anything you want, and you wouldn't get one word of international protest. And nobody could pass it. It would be an impenetrable wall. So if security is the issue, that's what you do. You don't increase security by putting a couple 100,000 Palestinians inside the wall. Well, that is so obvious that it really takes genius not to see it. Now, ask yourself if there is a single comment anywhere pointing out that this thing can't possibly be for protection of Israelis. It's impossible. That's not where you'd put it. So why not do it that way? Well, because if you do it that way, you don't steal Palestinian land. You inconvenience Israelis who'd have to go through gates instead of Palestinians who have to go through gates that are never open. So therefore it's no good. Well, that tells you what the wall is about. Okay? It has nothing to do with security, except for security for the Israeli settlements, which are illegal anyway. But so it's just a way of taking over, of advancing the U.S.-Israeli program of gradually integrating the valuable parts of the territories inside Israel, now under the pretext of security. But the pretext is so ludicrous in this case. You really have to admire the commentators who can't see it. And as far as I'm aware, that's 100%. I've never seen a word pointing out the obvious, which is obvious on a moment's reflection, that if you want a wall that's going to secure Israelis from West Bank infiltration, you put it 2 miles inside Israel. It's pretty obvious, isn't it? Can you think of a fallacy?
Thanks very much, Professor Chomsky. If I could just go plug, a lot of the sources which you quoted from recent news stories are on that website. So it's a good resource because Professor Chomsky can't be here for all of us every day. Just my one question. The Associated Press this morning, and this has been going on for a while, talked about how OPEC is thinking of changing to the euro. Is this a big deal? Or is it
it's a big deal. It's a very big deal. If you look at the international financial discussions, the euro is sort of creeping up on the dollar in terms of value. By now, it's overvalued. But as a currency that people are willing to rely on, it's creeping up on the dollar. If you look at bonds that are issued, it used to be overwhelmingly dollar. Now it's close to 50-50 dollar-euro. And in many respects, the euro is a more stable currency, safer currency. So Europe, for example, doesn't have the huge U.S. trade deficit. It's not the case that Asia lends and Europe spends, to quote Laura Tyson. And people understand that. Sooner or later, Asia, OPEC, and others are going to start probably using a basket of currencies, not just the dollar, but a mixture, and they might shift over to the euro. The effect of that on the U.S. economy, I mean, nobody can really predict, but it could be extremely serious. The U.S. economy is a very fragile system. You know, it's a very rich country and enormous advantages, but the way it's being handled economically is just a disaster. You know, and the world knows it. They're willing to support it for some time, but when that'll break down, nobody knows. And the potential that OPEC might switch to, even in part, to the euro, as it might do, is serious. In fact, that's one of the reasons, I think, why the U.S. wants to ensure military control over the region, so that the facade doesn't get any funny ideas. You know? I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave. Sorry.
Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. We're in Cambridge, Massachusetts with Professor Noam Chomsky. Thanks for joining us again. So you've done a lot of work on what's going on in the Middle East. You've been there recently. What's your take?
There's a core problem, the Israel-Palestine issue. There's other problems, but that's the core one. And there are a lot of problems in the world for which it's pretty hard to figure out a solution. This one happens to be particularly uniquely easy to figure out the solution. There is one. It's been on the table for 35 years. Virtually the entire world supports it. The only holdouts are the United States and Israel, at least in theory and words. Europe, non-aligned countries, the Arab states, the Organization of Islamic States, which includes Iran. They basically all agree on a political settlement on the internationally recognized border, it's so-called Green Line, pre-67 borders, with two states, Israel and a Palestinian state in the occupied territories, and possibly some adjustment of the border. It was a ceasefire line. So when the U.S. was still part of this consensus, it called for mutual, moderate and mutual border adjustments. That was actually brought to the Security Council in January 1976. The U.S. vetoed it again in 1980. This won't run through the whole record, but it's basically a record of U.S. refusal to accept it. Of course, Israel refuses. They want to take over as much as is valuable to them of the occupied territories. Now, since there actually is one occasion when the U.S. came close to accepting it. That was in January 2001, Clinton's last month in office. He provided what he called parameters for settlement. Both sides accepted them, as he pointed out. They met for a week in Taba, Egypt, tried to work out the details, and they apparently came pretty close to a settlement.
Well, I was in the Middle East recently as well, and one of the things I heard, we were in Ramallah, and we talked to a lot of Palestinians on both sides of the border, that the split between Hamas and Fatah is, number one, weakening any real form of resistance, and number two, that any state that might emerge out of this two-state, if in fact anything does, and there's generally a feeling that Israel, the current leadership of Israel and most of the Israeli elite has no interest in it, but that this split between Hamas and Fatah is really undermining any real Palestinian resistance. What do you make of that?
It's real, and there's a background. I mean, since the early 90s, the United States and Israel have been working to try to separate the Gaza Strip from the West Bank. By now, they're almost totally separated. A student in Gaza who wants to go to a university in the West Bank, almost impossible. If somebody wants to go for medical treatment in a Palestinian hospital in East Jerusalem, which isn't available on the Gaza Strip, it's essentially blocked, partly by Palestinian Authority and Hamas, but primarily by Israel. So that's gone very far. Even by the 80s, Israel had recognized it just wants to get rid of the Gaza Strip. It's so devastated, no use, hand it over to Egypt. That increased. In January 2006, there was a free election in Palestine, first one in the Arab world, carefully monitored and so on. It came out the wrong way. Hamas won the election. Okay, that's not what the U.S. wanted. And in the typical disdain for free elections, if they don't come out the right way, the United States and, of course, Israel instantly turned to harsh punishment of the population for the crime of voting the wrong way. Europe trailed along timidly, as it usually does. In June 2007, the U.S. and Israel tried to carry out a military coup to overthrow the results of the election in Gaza. It didn't work. It was beaten back, and Hamas took over. And at that point, sanctions became much harsher. And what you now read is, you know, Hamas by force took over the Gaza Strip. Well, it's sort of half true, but it was in beating back a U.S.-Israeli planned military coup initiative. By now, Hamas kind of runs the Gaza Strip with a pretty harsh hand. The Palestinian Authority runs as much of the West Bank as they control, which is very little of it, pretty harshly and with international support. And yes, that split is there. And both sides by now have a stake in it. Hamas to run the Gaza Strip, Fatah, Palestinian Authority to run the West Bank. And it's a barrier to joint resistance. Of course, the U.S. and Israel are very happy because they want to undermine the possibility of a settlement. Now, the settlement option is still there. January 2001 is not that far back. Things have changed, but not so much. And it's feasible. If the United States shifted its policy, right now the United States is basically blocking it. Blocking it not in words, they say, yes, we want it. But they're blocking it by providing decisive military, economic, diplomatic, and ideological support for the Israeli takeover. Ideological means, well, it's the way it's presented and discussed and so on.
Our most cherished ally.
Yeah, but it's significant. I mean, by now Israel, the settlements occupy over 40% of the territory. About 60% of the territory is called Area C, is under the control of the Israeli army. It's not necessary.
When I was in the West Bank and in some of the refugee camps in Beirut and in Lebanon, a lot of Palestinians were saying they thought that the two-state solution
is dead,
and that there's really is one state, and then they're all living under the same one state. It's just that some people get to vote and others don't, and that the issue now is that there should be a movement, one person, one vote, and that people, the Palestinians and Jews that want a democratic state, should simply take over the one state that's there.
Personally, I've been in favor of that since the 1940s, but it's pie in the sky. And they're omitting the fact, this is a common discussion on both sides and in the world, and it's just omitting an elementary fact. There aren't two alternatives, there are three alternatives. They're only talking about two. One alternative is the international consensus on two states. Second alternative, let's all live together in one state. The third alternative, which is the one that's being implemented, is that the U.S. and Israel take what they want and continue to take what they want. And those who are talking about let's have one state are actually assisting in that, because the United States is perfectly happy to have articles in newspapers saying, fine, let's everybody live together. Meanwhile, they are participating with Israel in separating Gaza from the West Bank, a crucial fact, and providing the decisive support for the implementation of the programs which are sometimes called the Sharon Plan. Take over whatever you want in the West Bank, everything behind the annexation wall. It's called separation wall. It's basically annexation. That means the arable land, the water resources, the pleasant suburbs of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, support the completely illegal expansion of Jerusalem. That's not only in violation of international law, but even of direct, explicit Security Council resolutions, which the U.S. indeed voted for. The whole occupation settlement program is illegal, and it's been known. Israel even accepted it in 67, said we're going to do it anyway. But it's not even worth discussing. There's universal agreement on this. But the U.S. is blocking it. And that permits these programs of taking over what's valuable, everything, hugely expanded Jerusalem, everything behind the separation wall, the annexation wall, the Jordan Valley, which imprisons everything else, a couple of salients cutting through it, which essentially cantonize the rest. By now, Israel's constructed a huge infrastructure project, huge highways and so on. You can drive from Tel Aviv to the most easternmost towns like Ma'ale Adumim or Ariel without ever seeing a Palestinian. Palestinians are sort of off there in the hills somewhere. So that's the real alternative. If there isn't a two-state settlement, this is what there's going to be. You can talk about one state and, you know, it would be nice to be democratic and so on, but nothing is supporting it. There's no support for it in the world. There's no steps towards it. Sometimes it's compared to South Africa, but what people are forgetting is there was decades of struggle to get the world to oppose apartheid. And in fact, until the United States changed its position in the late 1980s, it didn't really matter what the world thought. The U.S. was still supporting it. Reagan was violating congressional sanctions at that point. But until the U.S. shifted its position, it was there. As late as 1988, the Reagan administration condemned the African National Congress, Mandela's National Congress, as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world.
Do you see any potential for a change in U.S. position?
Sure.
To some extent, a change in U.S. public opinion?
Oh, there's a substantial change in U.S. public opinion. I mean, a lot of issues. I mean, there was a time not long ago when I talked about these issues. I needed police protection. And now there's huge audiences. They're engaged. There's what's called BDS, sanctions, divestment program, which is substantial. A large part of the American public, if they knew about it, would be opposed, in fact, outraged by the idea that Obama made a commitment to Israel to provide them with $30 billion of military aid over the next decade. People here are even talking about the U.S. military budget. Most people don't want it handed over to Israel. So sure, it would be, and in fact, if Obama or anybody in the administration was willing to take a stand on this, they could mobilize public opinion. Now, what's happening is pretty striking. The strongest support in the media, the most extreme support for Israeli expansion and aggression is the far right. It's the Wall Street Journal, much more than, say, the New York Times. In the political system, it's the Republicans, the party of big business, even more so than Democrats too, but they're more so. And in fact, you know, the military industry, high-tech industry, and so on, they think this is fine. You know, they're investing there. Lockheed Martin is delighted when we give Israel funds to buy, you know, advanced aircraft and so on. There is a base of support for these policies right at the core of the system. There's also a substantial lobby which is influential. Well, I think that's minor as compared with these more fundamental sources of support. But those are not, it's kind of like what we talked about on another occasion. It's not what the public wants, and that can be changed.
Thanks very much for joining us. And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.